Gershom Scholem, Alchemy and Kabbalah. Translated from the German by Klaus Ottmann. Gershom Scholem 1897 to 1982 was a noted authority on Jewish mysticism. His books include Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, Kabbalah, On the Mystical Shape of the Godhead, Sabbatai Sevi, The Mystical Messiah, On the Kabbalah and its Symbolism, and Origins of the Kabbalah. Klaus Ottmann translated Gershom Scholem's essay on colors and their symbolism in Jewish tradition and mysticism for the new expanded edition of color symbolism, the Eranos Lectures. He is also the author of The Genius Decision, The Extraordinary, and the Postmodern Condition. Translator's note. In translating biblical citations, I have relied on the Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures. The new JPS translation, according to the traditional Hebrew text, Philadelphia and Jerusalem, Jewish Publication Society, 1985. This volume has also been my guide for the transliteration of biblical names. Citations from the Zohar are, wherever possible, taken from the new translation by Daniel C. Matt for the Pritzker edition of the Zohar Stanford, 2004 FF. Transliterations of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Rabbinic names are rendered according to the Encyclopedia Judaica Jerusalem and New York, 1971-72. Bina. Gevura, Hod, Keter, Tiferet, Yesod, Malkut, Hokmah, Hesed. Netzati. Here is some benefit to be had from youthful core age and perhaps even from foolishness. Some 50 years ago, in one of my first large studies on the Kabbalah, I wrote about this subject, and now, more learned and perhaps wiser, although coming to the end of my career, I am embarking on it once again in order to develop it further. In doing so, I certainly will refer here and there to that youthful study. However, the perspective I have gained since that time diverges significantly from my earlier approach. Moreover, there is much new material at my disposal. GS2 since the end of the Middle Ages, when the European world became acquainted with Jewish mysticism and theosophy, the Kabbalah has been thought of as a complex intertwining of a multitude of concepts. The name of this arcane discipline became a popular catchword in Renaissance and Baroque theosophical and occult circles, having been declared and revered as the guardian of the oldest and highest mystical wisdom of mankind by its first Christian mediators, among them, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin. Since there was nothing to be feared from the very few who were knowledgeable about the real Kabbalah, it became a kind of banner under which the public could be offered just about anything, from the authentically Jewish or weekly Judaic meditations of deeply Christian mystics to the carnival attractions of geomancy and tarot card fortune-telling. The word Kabbalah stirred up reverential shudders and enveloped all. Even the most alien elements of Occidental folklore became Kabbalah. Even the natural sciences of the time, such as astrology, alchemy, and natural magic, were in some sense leaning toward occultism. Kabbalah continues to bear this heavy burden, one that at times obscures its true content, in the communis opinio, with lay and theosophical adepts, and in the language of many European writers and even scholars. In this century, with charlatans such as Aleister Crowley and his followers in England, and especially in the 19th century, with Eliphas Levi, Papus Gerard Incas, and other French theosophists of the Martinist school, everything humanly possible has been done to confound all occult disciplines with the sacred Kabbalah. Many books that flaunt the word Kabbalah on their title pages have nothing or practically nothing to do with it. It is important to separate those elements that historically belong or relate to the Kabbalah from those that have become confused with it by developments that run their course outside Judaism. To this latter group belongs the relation between alchemy and Kabbalah. For more than 400 years, the terms alchemy and Kabbalah have been synonymous among the Christian theosophists and alchemists of Europe. So much so that one might suspect that there are strong internal connections. My purpose here is to explore this subject critically. In the scientific discussion of the systematic relation between mysticism and alchemy seemingly aimed at the purely scientific goal of the transmutation of metals into gold, there are two very different perspectives at work. One view, as expressed in the great works of E. von Lippmann and Thorndike, regards these relations from purely external, historical points of view. 2. Another view, asserted with growing insistence and influence, describes vast provinces of alchemy as de facto internal human processes. Since 1850 there have been comprehensive undertakings in this direction, based on an almost consistently symbolic interpretation of alchemical processes and the actions of its adepts toward an understanding of the internal, spiritual life of mankind. Hence the object of alchemy is not the transformation of metals but that of mankind itself. The philosophical gold that is to be produced is the perfection of the soul mankind in the mystical stage of rebirth or redemption. First developed with extraordinary erudition in Ireland and America in the works of Ma Atwood and E.A. Hitchcock respectively, this view was adopted by H. Silberin, a pupil of Freud's, who gave it a psychoanalytic foundation. Inspired by Silberer, Sieglung interpreted this concept of alchemy in terms of his archetype-based analytical psychology, advancing it in books that would become widely known and influential. To this day, it is a matter of debate as to when this psychological aspect of alchemy first arose, and I do not intend to render an opinion about it. It is undeniable, however, that some prophetic biblical passages, such as Isaiah 1:25, which compares the catharsis of Israel with the refining of metals, could suggest such trains of thought. The comparison of God with pure gold in Hiob 22:24-25 also played a major role among the later alchemists. In his book, The Secret Tradition of Alchemy, published several years prior to Sieglung's writings, A&E. Waite deals in detail with the question of dating the mystical reinterpretation of alchemy. He dates the first such reinterpretation to the end of the Middle Ages. In any case, I would concede that, in all probability, a not insignificant share of famous alchemical texts, especially after Paracelsus's time, do not pursue chemical goals but rather are meant as instructions for the mystical work of mankind. With some authors one may also presume that they consciously had in mind a coincidence of chemical and mystical processes, which I take to be the case, above all, for the alchemists associated with the Rosicrucians. Here we are without a doubt dealing essentially with a mystical movement whose scientific tendencies are byproducts of their symbolism and symbolic practices. It is precisely in these circles that the identification of Kabbalah with alchemy has asserted itself most emphatically. Before we can follow the crossovers that lead from the Kabbalah in Christian disguise to alchemy, we must answer the following questions. What is the Kabbalah's relation to alchemy in its original sources, as a more or less uniform system of mystical symbolism in its classical evolution from no later than the 12th century to about 16,000, and 1. Was alchemy widespread enough among the Jews prior to or concurrent with the development of Kabbalah to influence the formation of Kabbalist symbolism? How little was known with certainty is evident from a by as eminent an authority as M. Steinschneider, who as late as 1878 wrote, "To my knowledge the Kabbalah teaches nothing about alchemy, even though it joined other superstitious disciplines." Even as late as 1894, the same author wrote of a lack of alchemical texts among Jews, which should be regarded as a virtue. At the same time, Steinschneider observed that the Hebrew literature offers curiously little about the Magna Ars. In the older alchemical literature written in Greek, in the writings of Olympidor and Zosimos, for instance, Maria the Jewess is Maria Hebrea, Moses' sister, and other Jews are indeed mentioned. However, these are pseudepigraphic, like most of the sources cited in this literature. The speculation advanced by some scholars that Zosimos, probably the most famous Greek alchemist of the 4th century, was a Jew is, as far as I can judge, not likely to be true. However, in the 11th century the Spanish Jew Moises Mosefardi, who became known as Petrus Alfonsi after his baptism, wrote a book whose content was revealed to Seth, the son of Adam, by the angel Raziel, which describes, among other things, the transmutation of elements and metals. 11. Indeed, the classical Jewish philosophers mention alchemy only in passing, and often deprecatorily. Judah Halevi dismissed the theories of alchemists and pneumatists, who in fact often appear side by side in Arabic literature. Their experiments had misled them when they believed to be able to measure off the elemental fire on their weighing scales to bring about arbitrary creations and mutate matter. Similarly, Joseph Albo did not think much of false silver, Meleketh ha-Alkirnia, produced by alchemy, which, when smelted, is revealed as fake P. The famous 11th century moralist Bahia bin Joseph ibn Pakoda expresses a more favorable opinion in the 4th chapter of his Hovo, Ha-Levavot, where he compares the tranquility of the soul with the efforts of the alchemists. Another advantage for him who relies on God is that he can free his mind from the affairs of the world, and purify his soul for works of worship, so that in the peace of his mind and the tranquility of his soul, in his little concern with the affairs of this world, he is very like the master of alchemy, who is well versed in both its theory and its practice. If his reliance on God is indeed strong, he is even better off than he. The master of alchemy needs certain conditions, in whose absence he can accomplish nothing, conditions not to be found in every time and place. But the man who relies on God is assured of his livelihood in any circumstance in this world, as it is said, Deut. 8:3. Man doth not live by bread only, but by everything that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. The master of alchemy never divulges his secret to another, fearing for himself, while the man who trusts in God does not fear anybody. Rather he boasts of his reliance, as said the sage PS 6:12, In God do I trust, I will not be afraid, what can man do unto me? Pakada goes on to compare the alchemist's hardships and sorrows with the balanced peace of mind of those who trust in God. The author knows nothing about any damnability of the alchemical enterprise. Even more remarkable is the derivation of the word chemistry from the Hebrew, which carried over from Arabic sources. Steinschneider cites al-Safadi, Evidaman, who did not know Steinschneider's reference, quotes from al-Sakawi, a 15th century author. The word for chemistry comes from chemia, 16, Alchemy and Kabbalah, for it is of God, an etymology undoubtedly derived from the Jews. The first Jewish alchemist can be found with certainty in Egypt in the 10th century, while alchemical writings attributed to Jewish authors in the Middle Ages are based either on errors or pseudepigraphy. The Jewish alchemical work of Zadith ben Hamuel, which is mentioned by M. Berthollet, was actually written by the Islamic author Abu Abdallah Muhannad ibn Umayl al-Tamimi al-Sadiq. In the Hebraic literature, a treatise on alchemy was passed off as being authored by Moses Maimonides in his role as physician and naturalist. It survived in different versions in several Hebrew manuscripts as Igeret ha-Sodot, in the form of epistles addressed to his famous pupil Joseph ibn Eknin. This treatise also exists in Latin translation, supposedly from the 13th century, when Nicolas Flamel, one of the few who, according to the mystics and alchemists, was supposed to have discovered the philosopher's stone, bought a papyrus book in Paris, Gershom Scholem, reputedly at a small price. It was a baptized Jewish physician, not a Kabbalist, who in 1378, in the pilgrimage town of Santiago de Compostela, disclosed to him the meaning of the writing, and therewith the secret of alchemy. The manuscript was said to have been composed by Abraham the Ewe as instruction for his consociates. The heading supposedly read, Abraham the Jew, prince, priest, Levite, astrologer and philosopher, to the nation of the Luz by the wrath of God dispersed among the Gauls sendeth health. Oh, this heading alone proves the fictitious character of the attribution. In any case, this account is typical of those who, in the eyes of the medieval alchemists, were the bearers of their wisdom among Jews. The existence of Hebrew translations of two writings by an author who called himself Abu Afla al-Sarakusti, but may have been fictitious, testifies to the fact that even before the spread of Kabbalah, alchemical writings were as popular in Jewish circles as other Hermetic books of Arabic literature. The surname al-Sarakusti points either to Syracuse in Sicily or Saragossa in Spain. If the author was indeed a physician at the court of the king of Saragossa, as he claimed, then he must have been active prior to Saragossa's conquest by the Almoravids in the year 1110. The two books that survived under his name exist only in Hebrew, however. There can be no doubt that they are of Arabic origin. The author writes demonstratively as a Muslim. The first book, Sefer ha-Tamar, is a rather odd treatise on the theory and practice of pneumatist philosophy, that is, the science of capturing the pneuma of the stars by occult means. The second book, Emek ha-Melech, deals with alchemy, its title, according to the author, a reference to the philosopher's stone. Both books are undoubtedly by the same translator, as their style is identical. Judging from the French terminology of the alchemical book, the translations originated in Provence. The general, introductory part of the book, which remained intact, 22 corresponds, for the most part literally, to its counterpart in the Sefer ha-Tarnal, except that in the former, the science discussed is not the doctrine of pneumatist workings and effects, but rather of alchemy. The second part contains detailed alchemical recipes of a chemical nature. There are no indications that Latin alchemical texts were known in Jewish circles before the end of the 13th century. one can safely assume that until then alchemical traditions came exclusively from Arabic sources. Judah ben Solomon ha-Kohen Matka from Toledo, who in the mid-19th century authored a Hebrew encyclopedia of all sciences containing highly derogatory remarks about the great art of alchemy, was fluent in Arabic, which in his time was not only spoken by the Jews of Toledo but often used by them in their literature. 23. Having made these preparatory remarks on the spread of alchemy among Jews, we can now return to the original question of how Kabbalah as a system of mystic symbolism relates to alchemy. The answer is one for which we would search in vain among the historians of alchemy. The core of all alchemy, however understood, is the transmutation of base metals into gold, the highest and most noble metallic element. As a symbol of the highest moral and spiritual status, gold is the center, or goal, of the work for all alchemists, including the mystics among them. Without this premise there is no alchemy. However, the status of gold is difficult to reconcile with Kabbalist symbolism. In the Kabbalah, gold is not at all a symbol of the highest status. The hundreds and hundreds of texts and lists of symbols, the latter occurring hundredfold especially in manuscripts that make up Kabbalist literature, are unanimous herein, with only a few very specific exceptions. Silver is the symbol of the right side, male donation, grace and love. White milk, in contrast, gold, the symbol of the left side, represents the female and strict judgment. Red blood. Wine. This division first appears in the oldest extant Kabbalist text, the Sefer HaBahir. 26. From the outset, this symbolism, conspicuous in the history of religion, does not allow for the possibility that the creation of gold would be considered essential, not according to the real, commonly shared Kabbalist world scheme, and surely not according to the internal, spiritual, theosophical world view. To this end, particular reinterpretations and artifices were required. How else could a Kabbalist consider gold to be the highest per? Alchemy and Kabbalah pose, since it represents precisely that which he still needed to overcome on the mystical inward path, namely, the din, the strict judgment. According to Zosimos, whose alchemy leans heavily toward mysticism, the man of silver, apua avopibuantioc, precedes the man of gold, expua avopubueltiot, 2007. In Kabbalist symbolism it would be the opposite. Therefore an antagonism arises between fundamental motifs. Although the mystical alchemists would not have noticed this in their efforts to consolidate all symbolisms at any cost, especially since only a few of them would have read, or been able to read authentic Kabbalist texts. As mentioned before, Kabbalist symbolism is rather peculiar. Elsewhere within the symbolisms of the Hellenistic Occidental world, and particularly in alchemy itself, the masculine is considered red and the feminine white. As in the naming of certain alchemical substances, white woman, and red man. Then again, the Jewish Haggadic development, which led to such paradoxical mystic concepts as the feminine, as a correlative to the strict judgment, is easily overlooked. However, this need not concern us here. Thus it is understandable that within Judaism practical alchemy was only rarely pursued in Kabbalist circles. These two areas did not fit well together and, as we will see, were connected relatively late. I have not been able to find alchemical recipes relating to the great work in any Hebraic Kabbalist book or manuscript before 1500s. Those recipes found in older manuscripts from the 14th or 15th century have nothing to do with Kabbalah, and did not originate in Jewish tradition. Although the fundamentals of theoretical Kabbalist mysticism conflict with the basic tendencies of alchemical symbolism, certain alchemical characteristics nevertheless became intermingled with the plenitude of Kabbalist motifs and symbols. Here a certain influence of alchemy can be accounted for after all. Of course, it is precisely the cosmological alchemical symbolism of metals and other substances that may belong in this group that received no attention by the alchemists of 16th through the 19th centuries, and played no role whatsoever in the Christian Kabbalah and in Rosicrucianism. They were not, however, without significance for the knowledge of the channels through which the late Hellenistic world affected the Jewish mysticism of the Middle Ages. One ancient fragment that preserved the alchemical symbolism of gold as masculinity can be found in the Bahir Sec. 36. It did not play a role in the systematical evolution of the Kabbalah. The fragment, about which the Kabbalists would have been completely ignorant after about 1230, is placed between two antipodal classical pieces of Kabbalist symbolism, Cs. 35 and 38. It reads, "Why is gold called Zahab? Because there are three principles contained in it, the masculine, Zakar, and the Tizayin points to that. the soul, and the Nehi points to that. Obviously the feminine, since the consonant He in the mysticism of the alphabet has always been interpreted as such. And Bet avouches its duration, as is written in the Torah, which starts with this letter, Lain the beginning. Here gold fulfills all the requirements of alchemical symbolism. It represents the mystical communion of the highest principles operating in the cosmos, which come about through the medium of creation, as much God's creation of the cosmos as the alchemical completion of the work. The symbolism of the Laking's daughter, which describes the function of the bet in the parable, corresponds, be it consciously or unconsciously, to the symbolism of the prima materia with the alchemists, which itself corresponds to the primal matter, the chaos during God's creation of the world. This passage, which is directed specifically toward alchemy, is rare in classical Kabbalist literature. But as early as the Tikkun HaZohar, which uses the Bahir fragment in number 21, this is replaced by a less fitting unexceptional interpretation based on the number 7, that is the 7 days of creation, since the reading of the Zayton as a masculine principle was unacceptable to the Kabbalah. Although disjointed, this interpretation still contains a glimmer of its alchemical origin. Gold as a symbol of the highest perfection of the creation, imbued with light. Evidently primal light. The conflict between the mystical and the profane appreciation of gold in the Kabbalah is sharply expressed by the attempts of the Kabbalists to explain why the value relationship between gold and silver in the natural lower world is the reverse of it in the spiritual upper world. These attempts at explanation spread from one classical passage in the Sefer HaZohar, the main text of Spanish Kabbalah, authored between 1280 and 1285, to many other works. Since the status of gold could at least be maintained in the lower Merkava divine chariot, and its contingent sensible world, there would have been room for purely material alchemical efforts. But this put an end even more strongly to the spiritual reinterpretation of alchemy as a mystical practice. The above-mentioned passage in the Zohar 2.197 billions reads, "Come and see here in Exodus 35:5. Gold is listed first and silver second because it corresponds to the lower enumeration method, perhaps from the lower world?" Had Moses wanted to count according to the enumeration method of the upper Merkabah, he would have begun counting on the right, e.g. from the silver, and only then on the left. Why? Because it is written Haggai 2:8, "Silver is mine and gold is mine silver." First and gold afterwards? But in the lower Merkabah one begins on the left, and only then continues on the right side, as it is written, Exodus 35:5, "Gold, silver and copper." The passage is clear, and the reversed order of the upper and lower worlds is a motif frequently used in the older Kabbalah. It played into the later theory of many Kabbalists that the creation of a lower world came about by mirroring the reflected light of a world of the Seftrot. Thus one finds this motif in the Talmudic sequence of the letters of the alphabet in both worlds, and thenceforth in the theory of the mystical names of God, and the Ephesia Grammata, Ephesian letters. To this line of thought also belongs the attribution in the book Esh, which will be discussed below, of the philosopher's stone to the last Sephirah, and lead the least precious metal to the second highest. The Kabbalists may never have been cognizant of the possible Gnostic antinomian consequences of this concept. How else, for instance, would certain texts have been allowed to be circulated that, according to this principle, not only sanctioned but commanded marriages that are forbidden by the Torah in the upper worlds? Even more radical is a passage in the pseudepigraphic Sefer HaPeliah 31, written around 1400s, which follows the same fundamental idea. With clear examples from everyday life, it explains that gold is more valued in our world, because we live in the eon of gold, under the power of the strict judgment. The passage shifts the mystically correct valuation to the eon of mercy, which preceded the eon of gold that was ruled by the Sephira Elaphisted. 32. Expositions of this kind are clearly in position to alchemical thinking. It is unclear whether Zohar 1.249b to 250a is influenced by alchemy. It states that, were it not for the ferocious beasts breeding in the gold dust-covered mountains, human beings would not be poor, because the power of the sun proliferates gold. That again, it was precisely the opponents of alchemy who drew from this natural relationship of the sun to gold an argument against the possibility of artificial transmutation of metals. Hence Judah ben Salomon ha-Kohen Matka of Toledo says, "The scholars think that gold evolves in nature during long time periods, while alchemy believes to accomplish this in the short term." Zohar 2a describes this. influenced somewhat differently. Inspired by astrology and alchemy, it discusses the influence of the stars on the growth of metals, wherefore the author invokes a fictitious book by King Solomon on the science of precious metals, which probably relates to one of the many lapidaries that were widespread in the Middle Ages. Prior to that, he cites a related belief from an alleged Book of Higher Oriental Sciences, which deals with magical remedies and precious metals. According to that book, a particularly prized type of gold grows on high mountains, where water is scarce, under the influence of comets rather than ordinary stars. 35th. A passage strongly influenced by alchemy is found in Zohar 2.23b to 24b. While there are no literal alchemical statements found there, it does offer a complete system of alchemical symbolism. Two-word far-word counterparts can be found in the Hebrew writings of Moses de Leon, who is regarded as the main author of the Zohar. 36. A close comparison shows that precedence should be given here to the Pseudo-Aramaic Zohar, which was in part copied and in part paraphrased and explicated by the author in his later Hebrew writings. Based on the Aristotelian model of the relation of the four elements to the four qualities, warm, cold, dry, humid, the following correspondence of the elements do metals and directionals is developed there, for which he could not find an exact parallel, having only inadequate knowledge of the later or earlier alchemical literature. Upper Merkabah, fire water. Primary metals north-south gold silver. Lower Merkabah, brass lead secondary metals. Air east copper. Tin 39. Earth west iron. Iron steel. The secondary metals are supposed to originate from the primary ones by combining their element with earth. The Zohar passage presents a long rigmarole of transmutations and interrelations that are strikingly formulaic. In the two parallel texts, Moses de Leon also draws on the biblical symbolism of the four streams of paradise and the 12 oxen of the brazen sea in the Temple of Solomon. I should mention that the specific passage in the printed text by Moses de Leon, as well as in the handwritten copies I consulted, is slightly corrupted, but can be reconstructed. Here one finds an explicit reference to alchemists. Copper is red, and brings about the nature of both gold and silver, because those who know the work make from it gold and silver. The denotation for alchemists, Latin anista, is a standing formula transcribed here into Hebrew for the work in the sense of the great work of alchemy, which in the Hebrew literature has been used for centuries. Although neither Moses de Leon nor the above-mentioned Zohar passage expressly refers to the Sephirot, there can be little doubt that the four elements and the four primary metals correspond to the four Sephirot: Lefesed, Gevura, Tiferet, and Malkut. Thus Tiferet represents copper, the union of gold and silver, and Malkut, iron. If the mystical ascension were to proceed from the lowest Sephira or from the purification of metals, then the lowest Sephira would correspond to the prima materia with which the alchemical work begins. Copper would then be a preliminary phase, from which gold and silver, both united within it, are produced. This corresponds to the interpretation of copper in a Zohar passage 2.138b that discusses the materials listed in Exodus 25:3 gold, silver, and copper that are needed for the construction of the tabernacle. There it says that the primarily reddish copper unites in itself the colors as well as the qualities of gold and silver, whereby those of gold dominate. This is consistent with the above-cited passage by Moses de Leon, which refers specifically to the alchemists. Indeed, it is well established that many alchemists regarded copper as a preliminary stage of silver and gold, just as Zosimos, in his much-cited alchemical mystical vision, knew of three stages: the copper homunculus, the man of silver, and the man of gold Lippmann, OPCIT, p. 80. The post-Zohar generation occasionally uses the above passage ZZZ3b as is, but often there are other associations of the metals with the sky directionals and the Sephirot, which are based on a system completely different from that of the Zohar. 43. The color symbolism of gold is divided into yellow and red. In the Zohar passage discussed above 2.171 billions, yellow appears as the color of gold, as it does in Moses de Leon's Shekel HaKodesh, which says p. 120. Gold comes into being from and is connected with the mystery of fire and the north, because when natural warmth approaches that which is cold, it produces a yellow nature, and that is the mystery of gold. Silver is attached to the mystery of water and the south side, because when water is combined with the sun, it produces a white nature, which is a mystery of silver. But copper is red, and brings about the nature of both gold and silver, because those who know about the work are able to make from it the nature of silver and gold. In other respects, red is always the color of gold. The symbolism of gold, as it is found in several places in the Zohar, is based primarily on a passage from the Babylonian Talmud Yoma 44b, which has several parallels in the Midrashim, where 7 types of biblical gold are listed. Incidentally, the above-mentioned Talmud passage reflects a knowledge of the change in color from yellow to red. For instance, the 7 types of gold were interpreted mystically by some Kabbalists, undoubtedly in the spirit of the alchemists, as the complex of the 7 lower Sephirot. There is a curious passage in 2.73a, which belongs to a section titled Raza de Razin, that deals with physiognomy and evidently is related to the medieval Secretum Secretorum, a widely circulated pseudo-Aristotelian tractate on politics, which also discusses physiognomy f. Here the symbolism of the 7 types of gold is used in the description of David's face. In the book of Adonai I have seen written the following: the shapes of the face of the first Redeemer resembles the moon. His face was greenish gold, his beard, gold from Ophir, his eyebrows, Sheba's gold, his eyelashes, gold from Parvaim, his hair, Sagur solid. Gershom Scholem, or locked gold, his chest, refined gold, both his arms, gold from Tarshish. This passage, which lets David's face radiate in all 7 types of gold, despite the fact that the moon alchemically relates to silver, seems to be rather conspicuous and remarkable in its obscurity. It is not surprising that David's reddish hair, which is described in the book of Samuel, would evoke the symbolism of gold. Curiously, this symbolism of gold in relation to the moon is mentioned nowhere else except in this passage. In the Tikkunim, written shortly after the composition of the main part of the Zohar, the 7 types of gold are also related to hair. 5.0. The Zohar still speaks of David's eyes as having been composed of the full color spectrum, and their beauty having been such that no other like it existed in the world. 2 related but diametrically opposed interpretations can be found back-to-back in the Zohar. The first ranks the 7 types of gold below silver, according to the classical schema. The other, however, reads like a mystical meditation using alchemical terminology, as if the author wanted a familiar interpretation to be followed by a more profound one. This sequence in the otherwise uniform Zohar passage can only be understood in this way. Paradoxically, the second interpretation functions as a continuation of first, even though it invalidates it. The commentators of the Zohar made great efforts to reinterpret this passage in terms of the Kabbalah. Baron Christian Knorr von Rosenroth cites it in his Kabbalah Denudata, IP 298, without calling attention to any relationship with alchemy. Devoid of any explanation, his translation is incomprehensible and partially incorrect. The short paraphrasing of the passage in Pauly's French translation is practically useless. In the following, as always, my additions are enclosed in brackets. Why, it says there are 7 types of gold. And if you mean that gold, after all, is strength and silver is love, how can gold be ranked above its silver? 51. It is not so, because gold is indeed higher than any other, not the common natural gold, but in the mystical way, and that is the higher mystical gold, which is the 7th of those 7 types of gold. And it is a gold that shines and glints in the eyes, and such is this gold that when it appears in the world, whoever obtains it hides it inside himself, and from there, e.g., from this mystical gold all other types of gold emanate. And when is gold rightly called gold? 3. When it shines and ascends to the glory of the mystical region, of the fear of God, and then it is in the state of the mystical bliss, which can provide joy also for the lower regions. And when it is in the state of strictness, that is, when it passes from that color into blue, black, and red, then it is the gold in the region of stern strictness. But the true gold belongs to joy, and has its place where the fear of God ascends and joy soars. Silver is among it, according to the mystery of the right arm, because the highest mystical head is of gold, as it is written in Daniel 2:38, "You are the head of gold." Its breast and arms were of silver. Ibid 2:32, points to the lower region. But when the silver becomes perfected, it is contained in gold. And this is the secret of Proverbs 5:11, like golden apples in silver showpieces. Thus it unfolds that, in the true perfection, silver becomes gold, and then its place is perfect. And therefore there are 7 types of gold, and copper comes also out of gold, when it is changed towards the bad, and this is the left arm. The left thigh is blue, the right thigh is purple, and it is contained in the left one. But the higher mystical gold is a hidden secret, and his name is locked gold, 1 Kings 6. 20. Concealed and hidden from all, and therefore it is called solid, because it is kept from the eye so that it has no power over it, e.g. cannot perceive it. The lower gold, however, is somewhat more perceptible. Not even Christian and Gnostic mystics and alchemists could have described the gold within the human soul more clearly than this characteristic piece of Kabbalist theosophy. This is the only passage in the Zohar that uses the transmutation of silver to gold for mystical interpretations expressis verbis, that is, presupposes it as a fact in the real world. Had the tendencies toward a truly alchemical symbolism, as expressed here and in the Bahir fragment mentioned above, par. 36 asserted themselves in the Kabbalah, then it would have been justified to contend an essential relatedness between alchemy and Kabbalah. But instead these tendencies were on the whole eliminated from the Kabbalah. The complete opposition of this passage to the one in Zohar 2197b discussed above is self-evident. A comparison with similar descriptions of what the alchemical mystics called philosophical gold, in the Zohar called mystical gold, Zahab Ilah. Here is a passage from Johann Isaac Hollandus quoted in Silberer's book, p. 101. The philosophers have written much about lead, and it is my opinion that this Saturnine work should not be understood in regard to common lead but to the lead of the philosopher. Know, my child, that the stone called philosopher's stone comes from Saturn, and know as a truth that in the entire vegetative work called so because of the symbolism of sowing and growing, there is no greater secret than in Saturn. Because even in common gold we do not find the perfection found in Saturn, since understood inwardly, pneumatically, its Saturn is good gold. Most philosophers agree with this, and it is only necessary for you to remove everything that is superfluous in it. Then, when you turn the inside to be the outside, which is redness, it becomes good gold. All those strange parables, where the philosophers talked mystically about a stone, a moon, an oven, a vessel, all that is Saturn, e.g., all talk about humans, because you must not add anything extraneous, except for what emanates from itself. None in the world is too poor to undertake and execute the work. The 7 grades of alchemical purification, corresponding to the steps of contemplation that pervade so many mystical systems and stand for an inward process of integration, were already known by Zosimos. It cannot not be ruled out that the alchemical parlance and symbolism might eventually have encroached upon unrelated Kabbalist territory. I know of 2 such instances, which were derived with high probability or certainty from alchemical terminology. In the Zohar, however, they assumed a completely different course. One concerns the short mystical sentences containing what appears to be a kind of witches, 1 times 1, especially in Zohar 1.77a, but also in 1.32 billions, 1.72 billions, 2.12 billions, 2.95a and 3.162a. One ascends to one side, one descends to the other, one enters between two. 2 crown themselves in 3, 3 enter into 1. The literal sense of the sentences is often not difficult to determine and much less exciting than the pathetic formulation surmises, but it is the external form that is interesting. The sentences sound like old formulas underlaid with new, fitting meaning. Such usage of old formulas that have become incomprehensible can already be found in the Bahir. Strikingly similar sentences have indeed played a large role in alchemy. I already mentioned that the fictional Umaria the Ewes appears in the oldest alchemical literature as a great authority. The following sentence is attributed to her. 2 are 1, 3 and 4 are 1, 1 will become 2, 2 will become 3. 6.2 This sentence, though not understood by medieval alchemists, but nevertheless passed on through the centuries as alchemical mystery words, 3 can still. 37. Gershom Scholem, be found in the widespread Latin versions of the originally Arabic Turba Philosophorum. In one of his early books, Waite saw in the literary form of the Turba, a transcript of speeches by the old philosophers, a certain affinity and relation to the Zohar, namely, with the Idra Rabbah. In this important section, Rabbi Shimon and his companions describe a gathering of the fictional great adepts in the Kabbalah, during which speeches are given on the mystical shape of the Godhead and its secrets. But Waite was under the misapprehension that the Pseudo-Aramaic word idra meant assembly or synod, in accordance with the Latin turba crowd. This meaning of the word idra, however, is a more recent development. 6.5. The second symbolism is found in numerous places in the Zohaj 66th, and I consider it to be incontrovertibly of alchemical origin. It deals with the demonic, the hypertrophy of the left side of a world, the defiled gold, scoria of gold or dross of gold. Here the classical Kabbalist symbolism, for which gold is the symbol of a left side, of the strict judgment, accords to some extent with alchemy, which extracts the philosophical gold from the scoria and scum of metals, both in nature and in the soul. The demonic, represented primarily by Samael, the prince of the left, emerged from the hypertrophic abundance of strictness as refuse or filth. 67. 1. Off the terms used here, hituke, literally to smelt, presupposes the notion of a smelting process wherein scoria or scum remains as waste. To this also belongs the terminology, long unexplained, of suspita de dahaba, which is common throughout the main part of the Zohar, where it explicitly states that it is identical to hituke. 9. 50 years ago I could not explain the meaning of this term and indulged in erroneous speculation. R. Eisler's conjecture that it is derived from the Greek owl olone, tit, namely, hylage, meaning putrefactio, decay or putrefaction of matter, is no longer sustainable, although at the time I agreed with him. Rather, suspita is one of many neologisms created by Moses de Leon from Talmudic words. In this case, it is a deformation of the word kuspa pomis, or husk. As in Ta'anit, 24 billions, the expression Zohama HaZahab was in use by the 10th century by the so-called Brothers of Purity in Basra as an alchemical term for dregs of the metals. Of course these dregs play a large role in any alchemical practice. Here, the author of the Lohar, who also knew Arabic, adopts a common terminology and uses it in a Kabbalistic sense. These substances are varyingly called dregs, scoria, or dross, words used synonymously throughout the Lohar. When suspita, however, is used only in connection with gold, we do not yet know why. The word used for the dregs of silver, which in the Zohar is identified in several places with lead. Zohar 3.124a, Tikkunim 67, Zohaljadash Phone. D. Isuhama. These are the only purely alchemical traces I've been able to find in the Zohar. To these can be added a further parallelism that was pointed out to me by R. Allo in Paris in 1972. It is undeniable that the symbolism of the Shekinah, the female aspect of the divine world of the Sephirot, which represents the last of the 10 steps of emanation within the Godhead, as it is richly developed in the Lohar, exhibits close parallels to the alchemical symbolism of the prima materia. I addressed the Kabbalist symbolism of the Shekinah many years ago in the Aranos yearbook. Many of the symbols discussed therein reappear in the alchemical literature of the later Middle Ages, where especially the moon and the corresponding symbolism of the female are developed in connection with the prima materia of the alchemical work. I do not believe that there are historical contexts for this. Nevertheless, there is a structural relation between the ascension from the lowest to the highest tephira, and the alchemical steps involved in the refining of philosophical gold according to a mystical view of the Ars Magna. By their very nature the symbols available for such descriptions were limited, not to mention the fact that their source, the Old Testament, was shared equally by Jewish Kabbalists and Christian alchemists. I am not sure that it is necessary to resort to the more far-reaching psychological hypothesis of archetypes of the soul, as developed by Kung in his respective works. There are only a few connections between Kabbalist and alchemical ideas in the generations following the publication of the Zohar. In his responsum on the transmigration of souls, the 14th century Toledo Rabbi Judah ben Asher compared the purification of souls during the process of the Gilgul with the corresponding alchemical process of refining metals, both of which are attained in multiple stages. Perhaps further examination of Kabbalist literature, especially the handwritten sources, will bring to light more connections. The most astonishing development took place at the end of the 15th century in Spain, in the form of revelations written down by the renowned rabbi and humanist Osef Taitazak around 1480.77. In these very curious revelations, God himself lectures on various occult disciplines. Taitazak is the first Kabbalist to identify alchemy with mystical theology, even before the Christian humanists pursued this line. This is even more remarkable as none of the great Kabbalists of 16th century, among them students of Taitazak, during his activities in Salonika until about 1535, ever adopted these thoughts. Neither Joseph Caro nor Moses Cordovero knows anything about that. Parts of Taitazak's revelations were known in these circles. but we cannot say whether they contained any passages on alchemy. There are 2 passages dealing with alchemy in a handwritten manuscript in the British Margoliouth number 766, that contains large sections of these revelations. They also refer to a detailed instruction on the subject at hand, which no longer exists, at least not in the manuscripts known to me. Folio L07A reads, "You will instantly understand the whole mystery of the lower world and the mystery of the upper and lower mystical and worldly silver and gold, and once you know the great science, you will instantly know how to make, in effect, without difficulty, in the lower world, each of the 7 kinds of metals. And this is the science of alchemy, which is the science of the Godhead, as you will understand when you reach it in these revelations. And who does not know the science of the upper world, Kabbalah beforehand, cannot practice it, alchemy. Mercury is named as the material to use with the 7 types of metal. The next sentence in the manuscript, most of which is corrupted, assures the adept that he could put the result of his labor into the fire or under the hammer 1,000 times, evidently without any harm. And one must perform the work in secrecy, so that no one in the manuscript, no tree sees it except for the one who processes it or works with it. Because this is the power of the work, that it would die instantly otherwise. And i.e.g. God will tell you further below the secret of the transmutation, and with it you will find your livelihood and live like the masters, and no other art will be required than this. So that you can devote yourself to my Torah." The continuation on folio L07b states that the Sephira Bina is the mystical gold of the true Kabbalah, and the secret of the smelting or purification Hebrew Urfer of the true Kabbalist. 42. Alchemy and Kabbalah. Metals is contained in the mystery of the Godhead. This authentic mystical alchemy has a counterpart, the manuscript continues, in the alchemy of impurity known to non-Jewish scholars. Thus there are men among the sages of peoples with an impure soul, who attained it, the mystery of the transmutation of metals. And if in the ancient days the sages of peoples with an impure soul stepped forward, it is up to you to step forward on the side of Kabbalah. And you, the recipient of these revelations, will need the knowledge of these secrets in the time to come, when the hardships are so great that no one will be able to live without it. 8. The ending corresponds to the dominantly apocalyptic view of the author, who believed that the messianic time was imminent. Of course, the equation of Kabbalah with true alchemy, which so distinctly makes an appearance here, should not come as much of a surprise to this author, since he has identified other disciplines he values such as astronomy or spherical trigonometry, with the mysteries of Kabbalah as well. One can find an earlier passage about alchemy, albeit one less extreme in its formulation, in folio 9ab. It serves as an explanation of Jacob's ladder in the Bible, on which the angels were ascending and descending. Great and mighty things will be revealed in the secret of the ladder, namely, how you will ascend in the secret of the ladder. And that is the secret of the verse, and angels of God were going up and down on it. And here the secret of nature will be revealed to you in the going up and down, because the secret of the going up and down is the secret of the science of the Godhead. And herewith the secret of the upper mystical gold and silver and the secret of a lower worldly gold and silver will be revealed to you. As you can bring it forth in actuality and in nature out of all 7 kinds of metals, and this is the true science of nature, which consists of the mystery of a ladder. Measured against these astonishing comments by Tytazak, which anticipate the later identifications of the Christian Kabbalists. Statements of the 16th to and 17th century Kabbalists on metals using alchemical ideas represent a step backward. An overview of relevant examples makes this clear. The Philosopher's Stone, the title of a fictitious book allegedly written by Sadiah ben Joseph Gaon of Sura, and cited in the commentary on the Sefer Yerah by Moses ben Isaac Botarel, a Spanish philosopher and Kabbalist writing in Provence, proves only that Botarel knew about this alchemical concept from oral or written sources. Botarel was notorious for his tireless inclination to invent titles and quotations from non-existent books. Around 1530, the Spanish Kabbalist Meir ben Ezekiel ibn Gabai, who was active in Egypt or Turkey, wrote an allegory about gold and silver to elucidate the 2 human drives toward good and evil. 9. He does not write about the transmutation of metals. I was unable to verify M. Geidman's allegation that Zacharias the Hebrew Prince Guzulfi, the founder of the Judaizing sect of Russia, who followed Prince Mikhail Olelkovich to Novgorod, was much sought after for his ostensible knowledge about the Kabbalah and alchemy. Naturally, there is some mention of Jewish alchemists in the 15th century. The metal arts of a David Rabi of Weiden, extracted from the Hebrew, are mentioned in several later compilations. On practical Kabbalah, this is evidently a reference to Rabbi David from Vienna. In 1420, a Luwish alchemist named Salomo Tubelein entered the service of the Landgrave of Leuchtenberg. In neither case, however, is there any mention of a connection to Kabbalah. In the narration of his wanderings in search of the philosopher's stone, Solomon Trismosin, the teacher of Paracelsus, recounts a meeting in Italy in 1480 with a Jew who understood German and practiced alchemy with an Italian tradesman. Their art, however, turned out to be fraudulent. A Marrano, Spanish crypto Jew from Jativa possessed not only magical books but also Hebrew alchemical writings. There are other sources that lead to Kabbalah, for instance. A text on the 7 ranks of demons from the 16th century if not earlier contained in a manuscript in the British Museum, Margoliouth, number 845 fols. 89 to 94. There, in chapter 5, it is stated that the 5th king of demons, named Maccabi I, is also the genie of alchemy. It is quite possible that this text, like so many other treatises about the different ranks and princes of demons, originates from the early Middle Ages. Information in chapter 9, paragraph 3 of Moses Cordoveros, Kabbalist Compendium Pards Riminum Krakow 1592, phone 69a has Kabbalist alchemical characteristics. Here, in order to explain a certain passage in the Sefer Yera, Cordovero recites from an unnamed source a kind of alchemical process in which stone-like particles most likely scale are formed in heated, simmering water. Speculating on the Zohar passage, discussed above, 2.23b, the anonymous author of the Galei Rizaya, written in 1552, possibly in Safed, goes much further by addressing 6 of the metals discussed therein: gold, silver, iron, lead, copper, and tin, and their relationships to each other. He does not mention brass, which he did not seem to have understood. If he had, he would not have named iron as the suspita of gold. He explains the magical powers of the metallic Yadu, a bird, which is discussed in Zohar 3.184 billions, with the correct combination of the 6 metals used in its iteration, 85. What is remarkable here is that the mixture of metals may produce impure powers that, as could be concluded, need to be overcome by separation. Writing in 1570, Simeon Labi, the North African rabbi of Tripoli and author of the Ketem Paz Livorno 1795, a barely explored large commentary to the Zohar, is amiably inclined toward alchemy. About Zohar 1.249 mentioned above, he remarks, "From this we can gather that nothing from the natural sciences was concealed from the sages of the Zohar. Because they knew the cause and essence of all things, they also knew that nothing exists in the natural world without having roots in the upper world. Know that gold and silver are identical according to the nature of their origin, their element and ore? Pay no attention to those who say that they are 2 separate things, for they see that there is one mineral from which silver comes and one from which gold comes, and thus they say that there is a difference between them. But that is not so, for there is no difference between them except for their color, for the essence of gold is silver at first. And according to the places where silver comes into being, there are minerals that are exposed to the heat of the sun, and as a result of their strong exposure, they become, in the course of time, red and turn to gold, for, as the heat increases, the white color changes and becomes red, just as you can see it happen with the fruits of trees. The side exposed to the sun turns red, while the other side, not exposed, remains white or green, for the sun reddens or blackens or whitens according to the nature and disposition of each thing, and likewise for minerals. Those minerals that are exposed to the sun and facing in a southerly direction are colored red, while those that do not receive much heat from the sun remain white. Thus, they are named differently on earth, gold or silver, depending on the difference of their location during the absorption of red color. You should know, however, that, in truth, they are one thing and undistinguishable, except in their location. Thus you find also that the wise men among the masters of alchemy do not concern themselves with other metals, nor do any work with them, but only with silver to make it red, for those 2 metals exist on their own, but have a common origin, as we were told by men of truth coming from Ophir, here perhaps East India. They found a mineral which was half gold and half silver, because it did not ripen sufficiently under the warmth of the sun, and they melt it down to let each gold and silver come forth from it separately. And I am writing this in order to make known to you the sages' wisdom, for nothing remains hidden to them. Thus Simeon Labi thinks something of alchemy. He even bends the Kabbalist symbolism in favor of the alchemical one when he asserts, a few lines further down, that the Kabbalists too call gold sun and silver moon. 86. This is in fact the symbolic language of the alchemists. His assertion regarding the Kabbalists is, however, highly doubtful, and as far as I can see, based solely on an allegorical reinterpretation of Zohar 1.249 billions. Although that is certainly not its literal meaning. As we will see later, even the author of the Esh Meref, who certainly would have been receptive to such ideas, has not dared to adopt the alchemical moon symbolism of silver. Not until 2 generations later did Abraham ben Mordecai Azulai, who, like Labi, was born in Fez, Morocco, where alchemy played a large role, adopt this symbolism in his commentary to Zohar 3.184b, which talks about Balak's magical bird. Here, indeed, gold and silver are linked to the sun and the moon. The passage in Azulai's commentary, however, seems to be derived from the Zohar commentary by Moses Cordovero, who does not mention such an association of silver with the moon in his Dictionary of Kabbalist Symbolism, Pardes Rimanim chap. 23, Fun. Il. Hayim ben Osif Vital, the most influential of Isaac ben Solomon Luria's disciples, has a completely different relationship to alchemy. About Luria we know nothing with certainty in this regard, however his disciple, who survived him by 48. Alchemy and Kabbalah. Almost 50 years, he died in 1620 in Damascus, left several testimonies relevant to our discussion. In his autobiographical notes, which he assembled under the title Sefer ha-Lefezionah around 1610, and preserved in his own handwriting, the complete text was published in 1954. 89 Vital says that Luria saw the following sentence from Exodus 31:4 written on his forehead, Uto make designs for work in gold, silver and copper, to point to my sins, that I have neglected the study of the Torah for 2.5 years while being occupied with the science of alchemy. And in the preface to his much later tractate on Kabbalist ethics, Sha'arei Kedusha, Vital complains about people occupying themselves with things that mix good and devil, truth and lies, or that are generally null duarim betalim, by referring to magical remedies, the science of alchemy and the practice of using amulets and conjuration, without being specific about which category they belong to. According to his autobiography, Shiv 1 lay Rabbi Ephraim Vital, the years he studied alchemy must have fallen between s. 1567 and 1569, thus before he met Luria, since he speaks there of neglecting the study of the Torah for 2.5 years when he was 24. This statement can indeed be confirmed with another manuscript, without a doubt an autograph by Vital, wherein he collected magical practices and alchemical metallurgical recipes. This important autograph was located for years in the invaluable Kabbalist collection of Salomo Musajo in Jerusalem, where I discovered it in 1930. The third part of the collection, Fols 34-45, written in 83 paragraphs in very dense but beautiful Sephardic script, deals with chemical practices and matters of the 7 metals. Here one finds a large number of detailed recipes of a purely chemical nature, which also contain much alchemical terminology. Perhaps one day the manuscript could be studied more closely from a photograph that was made at the time of its discovery. Even after Vital gave up his chemical practice of alchemy, he continued in his Kabbalist writings to use the symbolism of metals, which diverges from the Zohar passage discussed above. Mercury, the leading substance of medieval and later alchemy, also appears here in its Kabbalist illumination. It is the 7th metal, in place of the brass mentioned in the Zohar 9.4. Vital symbolizes these 7 metals according to their rank: silver, gold, copper, tin, lead, mercury, iron, as the 7 sephirot from Ifes to Malkut, and the 7 planets in Tradi. Shinal sequence, a truly alchemical astrological model. Mercury belongs herein to the Sephira Yesod, and thus to sexual symbolism. As C.G. Jung pointed out, the sexual significance of Mercury as can be found in some in medieval Latin visions. There are no ramifications beyond it in Vital. His classification is definitely new, as Mercury does not appear in any of the Sephirot explanations of earlier generations. In one such tractate, the Ladder of Sephirot, found in a manuscript in the British Museum copied around 1500s, the sequence of the metals is silver, gold, iron, tin, copper, brass, here simply called metal, lead. These developments take place first within the Spanish Kabbalah, and later within the one coming out of Safed in the 16th century. In later times, there are two tendencies that demonstrate interest in alchemy in Jewish Kabbalist circles. In the Occidental Kabbalah of the 17th century, we have the comments of the Prague physician and Kabbalist Abraham ben Shabbatai Sheftel Horowitz in his work Shefetal, printed in 1612. While generally explicating Cordovero's thoughts in great detail, in certain chapters not relevant here it falls back to the ideas of Luria. At the end of chapter 3 fols 6c to 37d, there is a rather elaborate Kabbalist theory of alchemy, wherein the doctrine of the transmutation of metals is developed as it is known by the sages of alchemy, in relation to the interaction of all worlds, and the Sephirot itself. It also attempts a new reasoning for the priority of gold over silver, using the 16th century doctrine of the four worlds, in which each of the 10 Sephirot is repeated according to its structure. The highest of these worlds, that of the emanations, is assigned to gold, while silver is the dominating symbol in the next lower world. Between 1620 and 1640, Joseph Solomon Delernedigo, a Cretan from Candia who traversed Europe for many years and made a name for himself as a physician, Kabbalist and philosopher, authored many, mostly unpublished, texts. The beginning of a treatise by Delmedigo on the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of the Philosophers is preserved in a manuscript at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. It was to have 10 chapters, of which only the first 7 pages survived. Regarding the extent to which alchemy spread among the Jews of Morocco, there is evidence all the way up to the 20th century. Even there, alchemy and Kabbalah often go hand in hand. A manuscript in the Gaster collection mentions a scholar and saint from Jerusalem who attempted the great work Hebrew Malacca, Lu. In December of 1928, I saw, in the Bodhab manuscript collection in Jerusalem, a single folio, written around 1700s in Moroccan cursive script, which contains alchemical tinctures in Hebrew. Also around 1700s, the Moroccan Kabbalist Jacob Katan occupied himself with alchemy, about which he wrote a didactic poem in Arabic using Hebrew letters, if we can believe Jacob Moses Toledano's identification of the author. P. The manuscript, which he examined in January 1929, contains no Jewish material, only quotations by Arabic authors such as Jabir ibn Hayyan, Khalid ibn Yazid, and al-Iraqi. I do not know whereabouts of the treatise, which comprises almost 50 pages. An independent and thus twice as evidentiary testimony by an African Jew to the widespread alchemy of Morocco can be found in a report of the noted theologist Johann Salomo Semler of Halle, of which I have only second-hand knowledge. A North African Jew who visited Semler in his last years told him that alchemy was widespread among the Jews of Morocco. The rest of the conversation, however, appears to have been apocryphal gossip. L02. In Jerusalem at the end of 1924, I made the acquaintance of an octogenarian Moroccan scholar Makhlouf Amselem, also Salam, who was a Kabbalist, as well as a theoretical and practical alchemist. Amselem showed me 2 large codices that he had compiled, one on Kabbalah, the other on alchemy. He told me that in his youth he had been the court alchemist for the Sharif of Morocco. I later found proof of this in Notes sur l'Alchimie Afsis 1906, an essay by G. Salmon, who by 1904 had seen Amselem's codices in Fez. He reports therein that Amselem became the court alchemist for Sultan Mulay al-Hassan, who dedicated all of his spare time to the study of alchemy, albeit more for magical and occult purposes than in search of the philosopher's stone. 1 and 3. According to Amselem, the Sultan had collected about 2,000 alchemical manuscripts and was trying to seize Amselem's codices as well. The alchemical treatises I saw were in Arabic language, but written in Hebrew letters. Shortly before his death, Amselem began to print his Kabbalist alchemical treatises, but he died in 1927, not long after his introduction, which I possess, had been set to type. I never found out what became of his manuscripts after his death. Second, area sources, even those without any connection to Kabbalah, tell us about the interest of Italian Jews in alchemy. In the 15th century, in his didactic poem Mayat, the poet Moses David ben Judah Rieti put alchemy at the top of his list of sciences under the Hebrew name 1. Rochmat ha-Serefa p20, a name I could not find in any other medieval literature. He makes no connection between Kabbalah, which he expatiates on afterward, and alchemy. At the end of the 15th century, one finds great enthusiasm for alchemy in a missive from the French Talmudist Jacob ben David Provençal to the Mantua scholar David ben Jehuda Messer Leon. supposedly written in Naples in 1490, shortly before the expulsion of the Jews from Sicily, then part of Spain. The letter praises the study of the profane sciences. Remarkably, it consists almost entirely of fictitious quotations, apparently composed for the amusement of the author. The author cites all kinds of fabricated excerpts on the sciences from the Palestinian Talmud, among others. The following passage on alchemy, allegedly from a commentary by the famous 14th century Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel from Toledo, on the tractate Shekalim, commenting on Ecclesiastes 7:12. For to be in the shelter of wisdom is to be also in the shelter of money, and the advantage of intelligence is that wisdom preserves the life of him who possesses it. The rabbi is claimed to have written, "It is like the case of the rich from the house of Marcoia," literally, house of shreds, who were adept in the nature of juices of gold and in peeling silver off dross. The alleged commentator understands perfectly well the meaning of this fictitious passage. That family of Marcan were alchemists, and they caused the juices of certain herbs to congeal and made gold out of them. They also knew how to easily separate the dross from the silver, and this is a well-known science. However, they will not reveal the herbs, whose juices they congeal and turn into gold. Loss. Based on the last sentence, it is unlikely that by herbs, the author means simply those substances that come forth in the alchemical processes. Throughout his letter, Provençal continues to praise the high rank of alchemy within the natural sciences. A 16th century Hebrew manuscript in Oxford Neubauer 1959 fols. 132-49, also from Italy, contains a book of spagyric art, a common name for alchemy. We know from a number of sources about a rabbi and alchemist by the name of Mordecai Danello, or according to another reference Danel, which became distorted to Dedel, who came from the Duchy of Milan, about whose career we know only from the time he spent in Poland, Bohemia, and Germany, where he must have stayed for some time, since he not only wrote in German but composed many German-language poems, albeit awkwardly. Danello is known as a follower of Paracelsus from a manuscript entitled In Cementa et Gradations Theophrasti Paracelsi Interpretatio Mordachij Danel, Udseo, identified by Southofen Castle W.E. Puckert. From this source, published a verse by Danello, perhaps more of a dictum, in praise of Salomon Trismosan, the alleged teacher of Paracelsus, which sounds quite mystical. Study now where you are from, and you will see who you are. What you study, learn, and are, that is what you are. Of all that is outside of us is also inside us. Amen. Beneath the poem is a reference to Danello's residence in Poland, Mardukis Nel, Judaeus, residing in Krakow in the year. Either before or after his stay there, we find Danello working as an alchemist in Dresden at the court of August I, the Elector of Saxony, reigned from 1553 to 1586. An avid and active adherent of alchemy, the Elector had a magnificent laboratory built in Dresden, the so-called Gold House. A manuscript preserved in the Dresden archive, although only in an authentic copy from 1779, describes the manufacturing of red geld ore, that is, the red tincture of the alchemists. It also contains prophecies about the fate of the Elector's successors. The Elector is said to have written the following in the margin of the original manuscript. We saw with our own eyes the works and labors made by Mardochai Rabbi Danel from red golden ore, and described hereafter. We spent, from beginning to end, 41 weeks on the entire work. August. From Saxony, Danello went to Prague, to the court of Emperor Rudolf II, 1576 to 1612. An even more famous patron of alchemy and other occult disciplines. Among the alchemists, the emperor was called the German Hermes Trismegistos. In Prague, Danello again composed verses on the demise of a famous past alchemist. In these, there is no indication of any relationship of this adept to Jewish sources, let alone to the Kabbalah. The historically documented author Abraham ben David Portaleone of Mantua wrote his Treatise de Auro Dialogi Tres in Latin in 1583, and it was printed in Venice a year later. Los. Portaleone distinguished among three types of gold: vulgar gold, chemical gold, and divine gold, the latter of which was the exclusive domain of the Kabbalists. Did he understand the symbolism of the Kabbalists? As far as I can gather from the literature, I have not yet seen the original book. He does not go into any detail on the subject. Around the same time, Abraham Jagel, a Jew who later converted to Catholicism under the name of Camillo Jagel and worked as a censor, became interested in the connection of Kabbalah to alchemy. albeit without immersing himself very deeply into the Kabbalist materia. 1. Hegel refers to, among others, the previously mentioned writings of Abu Afla, which had already been much quoted in Likutim. The preserved manuscript of Collectania by the philosophizing Kabbalist or Kabbalizing philosopher Johannan Alemano, a contemporary and acquaintance of Pico della Mirandola. It is worth mentioning here the alchemical interests of 3 generations of a prominent Jewish Italian family. Judah Aryeh, also known as Leone Modena from his Italian writings, was one of the most famous figures of his time. We know of his calamitous life from his own unusually frank, almost merciless autobiography, a testimony rare in Hebrew literature. He was an opponent of the Kabbalah. His uncle Shemaiah, who ran a pawn shop in Modena at the end of 16th century, was attracted to alchemy, but it cost him his life. A Christian lured him, under false alchemical pretenses and promises, into bringing him all the silver and gold from his shop, and Shemaiah ended up murdered and robbed. Modena, born 1571, was introduced to alchemy in 1603 by the physician Abrahameli Cameo, who 12 years later became rabbi of Rome. Alchemy was an occupation, which according to Modena's own account, involved a great deal of money. In December 1614, Modena's oldest son Mordecai, the object of his undivided love, turned full-time to alchemy at the expense of his Torah study, working with the highly adept Catholic priest Giuseppe Grillo in Venice. Modena writes, Mordecai exerted himself greatly and became well versed in it to the point where all the masters of that science, who had become old and aged in it, marveled at what a youth like him knew of it. Finally, in the month of Iyar spring 1615, he set up for himself a house in the Ghetto Vecchio in Venice, and made all the preparations necessary for the work. And he repeatedly performed there an experiment that he had learned and tried in the house of the priest, which consisted of making 10 ounces of refined silver out of 9 ounces of lead, and 1 ounce of silver. And he saw this and tested it twice as it was done by him, and I myself sold the silver. And I knew that it was true, even though it was a matter of great effort and exertion, and it required 2.5 Monatsschrift für Geschichte und Wissenschaft des Studentums 38 months each time. The end of the matter was that we were able to earn about 1,000 ducats in a year. Nor was this all, for I too spent my life trying to understand such things, and I would not have misled myself had sin not caused it. During the feast of Sukkot 50 ceased performing that work. Suddenly much blood flowed down from Mordecai's head to his mouth, and from then on he ceased performing that work. For they say perhaps the vapors and the smokes of the arsenics and the salts that enter into it injured his head. And he stayed thus for 2 years until his death, doing some easy things. I-12. I have quoted Modena's account at length because his description of his son's alchemical experiments may relate to the experiments of Rabbi Mordecai discussed below, who also used arsenic in the making of silver. An alchemical Kabbalist treatise that has survived in translations, the original is lost, and played a role in the non-Jewish alchemical literature after the work of Christian Knorr von Rosenroth is significant to our assessment and requires examination in the context of the interest of Italian Jews in alchemy. In his Bibliotheca Hebrea Hamburg 1721, Johann Christian Wolff lists the alchemical book Esh Meref Purifying Fire, whose title he translates erroneously as Ignis Purgans rather than Ignis Purgantis. As it is in Malachi 3:2, where this gold-smelting fire is compared to the day of the Lord. As his source, Wolff gives Detlev Kluver, an author generally hostile toward alchemy, who discusses the text in his Historische Anmerkungen über die Nützlichsten Sachen der Welt from 1706, p. 172 ff. I was not able to inspect this rare book until 1979 in Berlin. In it are several excerpts from Knorr von Rosenroth's book, which will be mentioned below, pp. 172-75. However, the title of the essay, The Gilden Kabbalah of the Jews, How to Transform Metals According to the Sephirot to Create Gold and Silver, does not correspond to the content of the book, in which the 10 Sephirot play only a symbolic role in relation to metals, and are not applied directly to the process of making gold. Kluver also claims that Yidus hold this book in such high esteem that no Christian is worthy of knowing its content or reading it. As evidence for this, he cites that not long since, an insolent Jew had uttered this very opinion all around the exchange, probably in Hamburg, where Kluver worked. And what mythology! After all, Kluver himself received all his knowledge from a Christian source. Knorr von Rosenroth quite surprised the Christian world when he announced on the title page of the first volume of his Kabbalah, Denudata Kabbalah unveiled Sulzbach 1677 that it included among other texts a compendium of the Kabbalist alchemical book Eshmeref about the philosopher's stone, etc. This announcement must have attracted the attention of anyone interested in alchemy. H. Kopp, the only historian of alchemy who until then had been troubled by this book, wrote that he looked for the text in vain in the first part of Kabbalah Denudata 114. But this famous scholar did not search thoroughly enough. Moreover, he took false comfort from his misunderstanding of a note in the alchemical book Kompaft Derwissen 1782, which he thought indicated that the text was mingled together with the Zohar and was thus unrecognizable. In fact, the first 20 quotations stand out clearly and are for the most part literal translations of the first 8 chapters of Eshmir. Knorr von Rosenroth could rightfully claim to have provided a compendium of this work, as the major parts are all included, albeit split up or dispersed among various places. The quotations are located in the first volume, pp. 116-18 Generalia from Chap. 1 pp. 151-52, Gold, p. 185 Tin, pp. 206-7, Ein p. 235, On Gehazi the servant of Elisha from Chap. 1st p. 241 Sulfur, pp. 271-72, Copper, pp. 301-5, Gold, pp. 345-46, Lead, pp. 35,960 Silver, p. 430, On the Dove as a preparatory stage of the work, 441-42 Quicksilver, p. 455, On the River Jordan as an alchemical symbol, p. 456 Silver, pp. 483-85 Silver, p. 570 Copper, pp. 625-26 Lead, and pp. 683-84 Iron. There remains the question of the character and authenticity of these fragments. The wording and content quite clearly indicate that Knorr von Rosenroth was working from a Hebrew source, not from Latin or any other language. In his literal, albeit not always correct translation, the Hebrew language shines through the non-chemical passages about which I cannot form any opinion. From Knorr von Rosenroth's rendering off the technical term transmutatio p. 548, with the Hebrew serifwe, may presume that the original author used this word. 116 wordplays such as equating yesod with quick. Silver p. 441, for it is the fundamentum totius artis transmutatoris, the foundation of the whole art of transmutation. Presupposia Hebrew text. The author, who was well versed in the Talmud, understood Latin, as is evident from his explanation of the word asperka as quicksilver, following Rashi's commentary in the Gemara tract. Gittin, phone. 69 billions, for it is equalto aqua spherica quia esfisera mundana profluit, spherical water that flows from the mundane sphere, spherica. With an aleph prostheticum would certainly conform to this Hebraic word image, if one were to confuse the consonants kaf and kot, as is frequently the case in Hebrew with foreign words. Thus a correct explanation is here supported by an incorrect reading t. The content of the text speaks even more clearly. The first chapter apparently contained an introduction, from which arguably the main part is quoted. The order of the 2nd through the 8th chapters is clear. The text, it is not apparent whether it contained any more chapters, was arranged by metals, in the following sequence: gold, silver, iron, tin, copper, quicksilver, and sulfur. It had 3 parts, a purely Kabbalist part, pertaining to the mystical symbolism of metals, and their relation to the Sephiro, incidentally. Without quoting the Zohar more than once, a purely chemical part recounting certain processes and operations, essentially without any relation to the other parts. And finally an astrological part, evidently at the end of each chapter, which describes the planetary amulets of the respective metals. This latter part provides relevant information about the origin of the text and is related, more or less serendipitously, to the first by way of the unrestrained use of gematria and numerology. The introduction presents Elisha, the disciple of the prophet Elijah, as an exemplar of natural wisdom and a despiser of worldly goods, which is taken pp. 117 and 151, from an interpretation of an episode on Naaman in 2 Kings 5:6. This is followed by a synopsis of the chapters to come. But know that the mysteries of this chemical wisdom do not differ, or are not far from the supernal mysteries of the Kabbalah. For just as there is a reflection of predicaments predicamenta in the side of sanctity, so there is also in impurity. And the Sephirot, which are in the Asilith the highest world, are also in the Asiya lowest world. Yes, even in that kingdom commonly called minerals. Though on the supernal region its excellence excellentia is by all means greater. Therefore the place of Keter the first Sephira is here occupied by the metallic root radix metallica, which contains nature, deeply concealed and in great darkness, and from which all metals have their origin. Thus Keter is concealed, and from it emanate all the other Sephirot. Lead takes the place of Chokmah. Just as Chokmah stand closest to the Sephira Keter, so lead emerges out of the radix metallica directly. And in another similar allegorical depiction enigmatibuses, it is called like Chokmah the father of the subsequent natures naturae. Tin takes the place of Bina, which shows its rigor and judicial severity by its grayness, which resembles the hair of old men, and by its gnashing p. Silver is related by all the masters of the Kabbalah to Hesed, primarily because of its color and use. To this also belong the whitish substances. Then follows the red. Gold is placed under the Gevura in the most common opinion of the Kabbalists. According to Job 7:22, it is also related to the north, less for its color than for its heat and sulfur. Iron is related to Tiferet, which is also called, according to Psalm 2:12, Ziranpin, the impatient one. 120. Netzach and Hod are the place of the androgynous copper, just as the two pillars in the Temple of Solomon, which were made of copper according to 1 Kings 7:15, are related to these two modes. Yesod is quicksilver, for this Sephira is given especially the surname Bay Living. Among medicine of metals see below is related to Malkut, because, among many reasons, it represents the two remaining natures under the metamorphosis of both gold and silver, the right or the left side, judgment or mercy. Of all this more will be said elsewhere, in this book. Thus I have handed you the key to unlock most of the closed gates and have opened the door to the innermost sanctums of nature. 1 2 and 2 and 2. But if anyone wishes to arrange this order differently, I will not be in opposition to him, for all is tended to one truth. For it could be said that the three upper Sephirot are the wellspring of all things metallic. Thick water, the prima materia, would be Keter, salt, Lokma, sulfur, Bina. The lower seven Sephirot would represent the seven metals, namely, Gedula, Ejesed and Gevura, silver and gold, Tiferet, iron and Hod, tin and copper, Yesod, lead. Malkut in such a system, the metallic feminine and the moon of wise, also the field into which are sowed the seed of the secret minerals, and as is implied, the gold water, as is written in Genesis 6:39. But know this, my son, that mysteries are hidden herein that no human's tongue can utter, therefore I shall no longer sin with my tongue but hold my mouth at bay. Kabbalah. Denudatai ppt tot 116-18. My impression is that not much is missing from this introduction, and that it may have had a complimentary closing. A few remarks on this long quotation are in order. The first scheme, in which everything is pretty much jumbled together, does not conform to any known Sephira symbolism or alchemical ranking of metals. That the highest Sephirot also encompasses lead and tin seems very artificial, and scarcely comprehensible in Kabbalist terms. The Sephira Lijezed is hereunder quicksilver, and understood as metal, and a symbol of male sexuality. This corresponds to several sources, which I have cited above, 123. No less striking is the assertion of the androgynous nature of copper, for which I could not find any evidence in the alchemical literature, even though it may be explained by the symbolism of the two copper temple pillars. The medicine of metals is a common name used by the alchemists for the philosopher's stone. It evidently derives its meaning from the alleged power of the stone to transmute e.g. base metals into precious ones. 124. On the other hand, there is a contradiction when, according to the much more plausible second scheme, Malkut is described with overt symbols of the prima materia. In the 8th chapter Kabbalah Denudata Thamai p. 456, the moon of the sages is referred to expressly as materia operas, material for the work. At the same time, the moon is called a medicine leading to white because it receives its white splendor from the sun. This second scheme is remarkable in two respects: the differentiation of the three upper Sephirot, which themselves are not metals but the wellspring of all things metallic, from the lower seven, which are actually six metals together with the prima materia, may prove that the author had already been under the influence of the innovations brought about by Paracelsus, who considered salt, in addition to quicksilver and sulfur, such a basic element, here called wellspring of all metals. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the so-called thick water is sometimes the surname of mercury or quicksilver, and sometimes that of chaos or prima materia, which of course can mean the same thing. It is unclear how the author envisaged the connections between the last sephira, which he equated so unambiguously with the prima materia of alchemy, and the first sephira, which belongs to the wellsprings of metals v. Secondly, there is in this scheme the bizarre interpretation of Genesis 36:39, with respect to the purification of quicksilver. This verse, which in the Torah ends the enumeration of the Edomite kings who reigned even before the Israelites in Edom, with the naming of the wife of the last of these kings, has a long and curious history, which cannot be expounded upon here. 126. The passage reads, "And King Baal-Hanan son of Akbor died, and Hadad reigned in his stead, and the name of his city was Pau, and the name of his wife was Mehetabel, daughter of Matred, daughter of Mezahab." The second name of the father, Me-Zahab, literally gold water, suggests an alchemical interpretation. As in the following dismissive remark by Abraham ibn Ezra from his 12th century commentary, some find here an intimation of those who make gold from copper, and these are idle and empty chatter. In point of fact, the word Me-Zahab was used in Hebrew around 1400 CE, an alchemical equivalent to gold water. 127. In addition to the author of the Eshmir Aref, another Jewish scholar, Benjamin ben Emmanuel Musafia, a physician and philologist well known in his time, published a Latin text in praise of alchemy titled Mezahab Epistola Hamburg 1640. The text deals at great length with the alchemical interpretation of this verse. Mezahab is the aurum potabile, potable gold of the alchemists. The author seeks to deduce the importance of Jews in alchemy from the Bible, and for this purpose rather arbitrarily consults numerous biblical passages and later sources. In doing so, he also uses an alchemical interpretation of the golden calf, a popular motif with Christian alchemists of the time. 128. I did not find a connection to the Eshmiaref, the author of which deviates from his own scheme of assigning the elements to the Sephirot, whenever his symbolism becomes too tight. Then its strange and ingrafted character becomes obvious. Thus he has to assign tin to the Sephira Netzaj, and gold to Tiferet, in order to sustain the alchemical symbolism of the sun, and accommodate gold status as the most perfect of stones. While the sun remains bound in the Kabbalah to this Sephira, gold is always assigned to the strict judgment. The moon symbolism of silver had to be completely abandoned by him since, in the Kabbalah, it represents the last Sephira Malkut, and can in no way be related to Hesed, toward which the silver symbolism of the Kabbalah tends. In any case, gold does not occupy an overly significant place in the whole scheme, since the author generally yields to this symbolism. Nor does he have any particular reason to emphasize it, and one can understand why he cites and teaches only one of the chemical practices, the transmutation to attain silver process, which he describes in detail, partly in chemical terms, and partly in alchemical symbols, is to take about 4 months. In Re Metallica de Argento, Knorr von Rosenroth cites the work of a Rabbi Mordecai, from the 3rd chapter of the Eshmiaref, I. pp 483-85. B. Suler identifies him as Mordecai, the son of Leon Modena, who transmuted lead to silver and perished from alchemical processes. If the assumption that Modena's son left behind writings of his own were indeed correct, our text would have to be dated between 1620 and 1660. And Knorr von Rosenroth would have gotten hold of it not long after it was written. Nothing else, however, speaks for such a late date. We know with certainty only that the author used the Cremona edition of the Zohar 1560, since he refers to its pagination. P. He was moved by a passage at the end of the Zohar on the responsibility of the true physician to search occult books for the mysteries of the healing of creatures by means of alchemy. Only a historian of alchemy could determine whether an analysis of the chemical processes described in the text would help to date it more precisely. I am unable to identify them in other writings. In any case, they represent the typical mixture of scientific and mystical alchemy. In terms of its terminology, the Hebrew text of the quote, likely of Italian origin, should be highly interesting. However, I have not been able to reconstruct it completely. At the end, Mordecai adds the following. This should be compared to the writings of the Arab philosopher, for he dealt with arsenic in greater detail. Indeed, arsenic plays an important part in this process. The Arab philosopher is not Jabir ibn Hayyan Latin Geber, but rather Ibn Sina Latin Avicenna. De Anima in Arte Alchemiae, a rather elaborate text that was attributed to him, deals at length with the four spirits, one of which is arsenic tapi. Rabbi Mordecai may have known the Latin translation of this book. That he knew Latin is evident from his discussion of the Latin name for the planet Jupiter, Hebrew Tzedek, which was forbidden to be uttered because of its derivation from a pagan cult. His explanation of iron combines Kabbalah with alchemy in its symbolism. This metal is the middle line reaching from one end to the other. In the Kabbalah, this is a definition of the Sephira Tiferet. Here it is that male and bridegroom, without whom the virgin cannot be impregnated. This is the son of the wise, without whom the moon would be in perpetual darkness. He who knows its rays works in daylight, the others grope in the night. P. I do not understand the alchemical exposition of lead and sulfur. I. 32 elsewhere. He assumes that the alchemical symbolism of the green, red and black lion is known. F. It is impossible for me to determine the age of the text, except for the speculation that here mentioned Rabbi Mordecai is the son of Leone Modena. I have already demonstrated that the text cannot have been written before 1560. While the author was familiar with the migration of alchemists through the four worlds in the later Kabbalah, he makes no mention of the specific ideas of the Lurian Kabbalah that began to spread from Italy in the beginning of the 17th century. The unrestrained use of gematria, even in its most excessive forms, would point to a later date, while the form the book takes of addressing a disciple, which was used less frequently by later Kabbalists, would suggest an earlier date. It is also important to consider the third, astrological part of the book. Knorr von Rosenroth's source provides the magic square Kamea amulet for each metal, with the numbers referring to the corresponding planet top. This conforms to the classical astrological tables. However, most of the actual squares differ from those found in the older astrological magic of the Middle Ages, preserved in a Hebrew manuscript, Munich 214 fols, 145-46. I arranged the table of these correlations below according to the traditional planetary system, not the Kabbalist system of the Sephirot. Planet, row number of the magic square, Saturn 3, metal, lead, Sephira, 1 Lochma, Sephira of metals in vital, Hod, Jupiter 4 Tinbina an Netzat, Mars 5 iron Tiferet Malkut, Sun 6 gold Gevura and Tiferet Gevura, Venus 7, Mercury 8, Moon 9 copper, quicksilver, silver, Hod, Yesod, Besed, Tiferet, Yesod, 1 Lesed. It becomes clear from this table that Knorr von Rosenroth's symbolism did not originate in Kabbalist circles, where the sequence of the Sephirot would have undoubtedly determined the numerical order of the squares, but rather in astrological circles, where the order of the planets is determined by their reverse proximity to the Earth, as it was understood at the time. Evidently this was done with conscious systematical intent. Already the fact that Saturn is here related to Ophokma, while the Tikkun HaZohar, around 1300s for instance, related it to the lowest Sephirot Yesod or Malkut, attests to its incompatibility with the old Sephira symbolism of the Kabbalah. I believe, however, that the origin of these planetary amulets can be determined with certainty. They only penetrated Jewish circles through the well-known book by Cornelius Agrippa of Nettesheim, De Occulta Philosophia, which was published in its entirety for the first time in Cologne in 1533. A date that accords with the assumed date of the subsequent editions, published in Paris 1567, and Lyon 1600, found an especially large readership. Agrippa introduces this entire symbolism, with the exception of the sun, exactly as found in our text, for the first time into wide circles of the Occident, although it had been known since the 14th century. He dedicates an entire chapter 22 of Book 2 to it. He quotes neither directly from the Arabs from whom it likely derives, nor from the Kabbalists, but simply from magical books, that is, from manuscripts related to the magical text Picatrix Gayat el-Hakfam Fil Seer, 136. Had he used Kabbalist sources, an author such as Agrippa, who was obsessed with the Kabbalah, would not have failed to allude to that fact. Agrippa's planetary characteristics are completely unfamiliar to Jews, and were likely invented by him. On the Jewish side, we have the Sicilian rabbi Nissim Abulfarash, the father of Flavius Mithridates Guglielm Raimundus Moncadal p. the famous translator of Kabbalist and Arabic texts, who attests to his having practiced magic. He also had a gold amulet of the sun made, depicting on one side the typical image of a lion, and on the other, a magic square that according to Agrippa's table and earlier Arabic sources, represented Saturn. The contradiction to the systemization of numerical squares according to the planetary order is evident here. This Sicilian rabbi, possibly of Egyptian or Syrian descent, did not yet know the later scheme. There is no evidence that the author of the Mefaref understood Arabic, and drew directly on Arabic sources. That he understood Latin has already been demonstrated above. Had he been under the influence of a Latin source, it would have been that of Agrippa, if not a later one. Indeed, our text seems to be the only book that assimilates Agrippa's ideas. Since it had limited distribution and left no trace in the Jewish literature, it may be said that it was premature of authors such as Athanasius Kircher in Oedipus Laegyptiacus, published in 1653, a quarter century before the publication of the Kabbalah Denudata, and others after him, to pass these planetary amulets off as Kabbalistic. The author of the Mefaref himself nowhere characterizes his text as Kabbalistic. All but one of the magic squares cited by him match those of Agrippa, the square of sun, namely of gold. Here the author substitutes the sum of the numerical row, with the sum 216 in order to emphasize the relation to the lion, the symbol of strength, and the Sephira Gevura. The Hebrew word for lion, Ari, has the numerical value 216. Thus Agrippa's scheme was changed in one detail in favor of the Sephira symbolism. Thus we seem to be dealing in this text with a Kabbalist alchemical syncretism, the use of which one would not put past a learned Italian Jew from the time between the years 1570 and 1650. Following the prevailing Kabbalist symbolism, the text, as mentioned before, speaks less about the making of gold than the general transmutation of metals, and specifically the creation of pure silver from impure base metals. The various Kabbalist chemical and astrological elements are only loosely connected. This singular attempt to connect the three shows more than anything else how little they have in common, and how difficult it is to link specific aspects of Kabbalist symbolism with alchemical astrological symbolism, as we have seen above with Osif Taitazak, in my judgment. This rather inept attempt speaks as much against the existence of a true Kabbalist alchemical tradition and tendency among Jews as it attests to the strength of non-Jewish influences on individual Kabbalists, which would be most probable in Italy. Except for Knorr von Rosenroth, no one knew about this text. The assertion of the English theosopher and occultist W.W. Westcott, who belonged to the circle around Madame Blavatsky, that the Mira still existed in a Hebrew, or rather Aramaic Chaldean text as a special tractate, merits no credence. The fate of Knorr von Rosenroth's copy can no longer be ascertained. It is not in his estate, the major part of which was given to his friend, Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont. It is certain that those authors who wrote after him only knew the book from the Kabbalah Denudata. For those friends of alchemy who could not afford Knorr von Rosenroth's expensive Latin opus magnum, or perhaps did not read Latin, an anonymous author who called himself a lover of Philolithas made an English translation entitled A Short Inquiry Concerning the Hermetic Art, addressed to the studious therein, to which is annexed a collection from Kabbalah Denudata, and translation of the chemical Kabbalistical treatise, entitled Jesh Mezaref, 01, Purifying Fire. Published in London in 1714, the book contains the Latin text of the fragments as well as their English translation, in a copy at the Jewish National Library in Jerusalem. The original owner, Daniel Cohen d'Azevedo, a contemporary who belonged to the Portuguese Jewish community of London, wrote that he received his book from the author whom he identified as Robert Kellum. A reprint, revised and in some places corrected, was published by Westcott under the pseudonym Sapir Ode, with a preface in which he writes about the book. The Aish Mezaref is almost entirely alchemical in its teachings, and is suggestive rather than explanatory in its words. The allegorical method of teaching runs through it, and the similes have to be kept carefully in mind, otherwise confusion will result. Several alchemic processes are set out, but not in such a way that they could be carried out by a neophyte. Any attempt to do so would discover that something vital was missing at one stage or other. 140. Since the text no longer existed in its entirety, it should be no surprise that pseudo-epigraphy soon set in. The impossible assertions in their titles alone speak for their inauthenticity, and for belonging to the 18th century. Many of the manuscripts were offered for sale in the 1786 catalogue of the Viennese book dealer Rudolf Graffer. In this catalogue, a commentary on the Compendium of Esh Mezaref with a preface was offered, written by Leander de Meer, an otherwise unknown author. There is also a golden Kabbalah of Jews, as well as instructions of the Sephirot about how the transmutation of metals is to come about, which seems to go back to Kluver's title. The pretentiousness of this title is nothing compared to the mysterious text that J.K. Huysmans invented in the 6th chapter of his novel La Basse, where a great Satanist took from one of the shelves of the library a manuscript, which was none other than the Ash Mizaref, the book of the Jew Abraham, and of Nicholas Flamel, restored, translated, and annotated by Eliphas Levi. 141. The mysterious manuscript, in which all texts are jumbled together, is printed in the supplement, pp. 407 ff. To la Clef des Grands Mystères, Paris, 1860, by Eliphas Lévy Alphonse Louis Constant, 1810 to 1875, and was dreamed up as a rediscovered text of the Esh Mizaref, whereby the great mystagogue, who today still has his readers, proves himself to be a true descendant of the old alchemical mystical pseudo-epigraphy. Thus Knorr von Rosenroth was able to allude to this function of the Kabbalah as mystical alchemy in a verse of the Latin dedication, which prefaces his book in the form of an explanation of the allegorical frontispiece. Alterat abstrusos minerarum in cord meatices, it changes the abstruse course of the minerals in the heart. Little is known of Jewish alchemy after the composition of the Esh Mezaref, and even less of any connection to Kabbalist ideas. We have already dealt with Moroccan alchemy. Here and there one finds alchemical recipes for making gold or for coloring metals in later manuscripts, especially in collectania of so-called practical Kabbalah, a term that in the Hebrew parlance means nothing other than magic. The authenticity of a report about an adept in Hamburg named Benjamin Jesse is highly dubious. An anonymous informant who claimed to have been taken into Jesse's home from a foundling hospital reports that Jesse lived so solitarily that no one knew of him. When he died in 1730 at the age of 88, his adopted son received a handsome bequest, while the remaining assets went to two cousins in Switzerland. Among those were a can of weighty scarlet-colored powder scrapings from the Philosopher's Stone, and something comparatively less valuable, namely, 4 large crates filled with gold bullion. Kopp, who read this report, rightly assumes this to be a fictitious tease to make the mouths of the alchemists water. 142. The report also gives an accounting of the adept's last day, including his reciting Hebrew psalms and drinking a little Malvasia wine shortly before his death. There is, however, no Benjamin S. buried in the old Jewish cemetery in Hamburg. Why? In contrast is Samuel Jacob Chaim Falk, widely renowned in his time as Dr. Falk, and even more famous under the moniker Baal Shem of London. Falk was born in either Firth or Podhas about 1708, and died in London in 1782. The numerous contemporary reports and polemics on him can be amended and verified by his own manuscripts and the diary of his famulus. 145. It seems certain that he was at the same time a Kabbalist, a practicing magician, and an alchemist, but about his alchemical practices we have the least concrete material. For one, there is the independent testimony of his disciple Rabbi Tobiah ben Yehuda from the Krakow region, who in 1773 told the Hebraist and diarist Ezra Stiles at Yale University that he himself had seen the Philosopher's Stone and the transmutation of metals That Stiles's conversational partner came indeed from London, where he might have seen such practices at Dr. Falk's, is authenticated. As esteemed as the Baal Shem of London was in non-Jewish circles, even within the aristocracy, as controversial was his reputation among the Jews. It was tainted not only by the dark aura of magic, but by the even darker, presumably not baseless accusations of being a crypto-Shabbathaean. When he died in 1782, the epitaph on his grave praised him as an accomplished sage and adept in Kabbalah. The famous Jerusalem emissary and eminent scholar Chaim Joseph Azulai, however, spoke out against him with profound disapproval when the highborn Marquesa de Croix told him in Paris that she, a non-Jewess, was taught practical Kabbalah by Falk. Considerably more dubious was the reputation of 3 men who practiced alchemy in the last quarter of the 18th century. The first one was Jacob Frank, the founder of the Frankist sect, about whom I have written elsewhere v. We know that he set up alchemical laboratories, first in Brunn and later in Offenbach, and that he referred to alchemy several times in his instructions to his disciples. To the outside world, however, Frank and his nephew Moses Dobruska, whose alchemical activities cannot be doubted, were feigned Catholics. Dobruska, who converted to the Catholic faith in 1773, was elevated to nobility in Vienna in 1778 as Franz Thomas Edler von Schönfeld. ESO. Together with Ephraim Joseph Hirschfeld. P. who did not convert, he became one of the main conspirators of the Knights of St. John. The Evangelists for Asia in Europe, a secret society of Freemasons that was much talked about in Germany and Austria between 1783 and 1790. Not least because it was the first German-speaking fraternal order to accept Jews. 152. The writings of these Asiatic brethren, as they were commonly called, some published in print, leave no doubt about the alchemical tendencies of the group. They did not derive, however, from Jewish Kabbalist tradition, but are connected with the Rosicrucianism of the late 18th century, about which I will speak below. There is no doubt that beyond their rather modest alchemical proclivities, these four men also had Kabbalist, or rather, heretic-Kabbalist convictions. But from a Jewish perspective, they were clearly mere marginal figures at or beyond the boundaries of Jewish tradition. 83. 3. DN. Concluding this study, I will return to the initial question of how alchemy and Kabbalah became widely synonymous among the Christian theosophers and alchemists of Europe, and the impact of this process of identification on its literature. Two elements were primarily responsible for this questionable transition from the Kabbalah to alchemy, as it occurred after 1500s and particularly after 1600s. There is a third element, the market criers, which I am setting aside here, without minimizing their influence. To them apply the words of H. Kopp in reference to certain types of alchemical Kabbalist works. Here, Kabbalah was only the bait, mostly already employed in the titles, to lure curious readers into buying books by authors who knew nothing about this sort of occult knowledge. It is difficult to ascertain from Kopp's somewhat ironic remarks, made after the publication of the Kabbalah Denudata, whether he felt there were other elements that contributed to a true connection between alchemy and Kabbalah. In any case, the following comments will pursue a different course. One could say that Pico della Mirandola's sensational thesis, duly condemned by the Pope, that Kabbalah and magic were two sciences that more than any other prove the divine nature of Christ, was the starting point for this identification of Kabbalah with other disciplines. In the case of Pico, it was a matter of introducing Kabbalah into the symbolic world of the Florentine circle around Marsilio Ficino and their pursuit of a religion and tradition common to all mankind. For Pico and his followers, such as Johannes Reuchlin, Cardinal Egidio da Viterbo, the Franciscan Francisco Giorgio, and the learned convert Paolo Riccio, it was not yet about alchemy. But the two elements essential to this process of transition did indeed originate, if not yet in systematic form, in his writings, namely, in the Christian reinterpretation of Kabbalah and magic, as he understood it. The natural magic of the 16th century, which was based primarily on the occulta philosophia of Agrippa of Nettesheim, is of course already far removed from Pico's concept of magic. It instead absorbed medieval aspects of angelology, demonology, and necromancy. In his great work, which was intended to integrate all the occult sciences, Agrippa, influenced by Reuchlin's two books on the subject of Kabbalah identified Kabbalah largely with magic. He adopted certain elements of speculative Kabbalah that fit into his occult system, sometimes making highly incorrect associations, as in Book 3, Chapter 10. In regard to the relation of the seven Sephirot to the metals, Agrippa did not possess an in-depth knowledge of the Kabbalist teachings and symbolism, but he stood his ground, welding together Jewish medieval and Christian angelology and demonology. Every one of his faithful disciples, and there was no shortage of them, could characterize the Pythagorean nature symbolism, in good conscience, as Kabbalist. It should not come as a surprise that soon after Agrippa, especially in the second half of the 16th century, there was a stream of novel cosmological and cosmogonic ideas. Most of them derived from scholarly speculation and the existing framework of natural magic. In the area of alchemy, the influence of Agrippa is especially reflected in Stefan Michelsbacher's Sive Speculum Artis et Natura in Alchemia, Augsburg, 1616, reprinted several times. Its alchemical Kabbalist tables have nothing to do with Jewish Kabbalah. It should also be noted that the notion of Kabbalah as the lowest kind of magic art has to be attributed to Agrippa as well. Agrippa's learned magic lost its credibility in the scholarly world. It entered the lower social groups, naturally much simplified, or rather brutalized, and thus still continues to play a role to this day in Western magic literature, often glorified as Kabbalah. These are the connections that have emerged most vividly from the research on the Faust myth and Faustian magic books p.i. The relationship of natural magic to Kabbalah, which lacks any alchemical momentum, can be determined quite precisely, but I cannot explain the relationship of Paracelsus to the connection of alchemy, magic, and Kabbalah based on my own studies. The ambiguous position of the most important occultist of the 16th century on Kabbalah, which Paracelsus knew from Reuchlin's and Agrippa's writings, requires its own study, for which I do not have the necessary resources here in Jerusalem, in particular, the large critical edition by K. Sudoff. II Major. Works by Puckert that deal in depth with Agrippa, Paracelsus and their disciples, Pansophy 1936, and Gabalia 1967, leave me at a loss on the question of Paracelsus's position. I am hopeful that some other critically inclined scholar will one day tackle this complex problem. 20 years ago, a friend and I paid an unforgettable visit to the wonderful mystical library of Oskar Schlag in Zurich, where I pulled from the shelf a volume of the Sudhoff edition of Paracelsus's works. My immediately fell upon a sentence that began with the words, "The devil, the great Kabbalist that he is." As it a coincidence? Much later I learned that Paracelsus differentiated between a devilish and a divine Kabbalah, one he condemned, the other he raised heavenward. From the equivalence of experimental magic with Kabbalah in Agrippa and his school, the alchemists eventually drew the conclusion that the natural, experimental, yet occult processes of alchemy could also fall under the collective term of Kabbalah. Similarly, the more mystically and theologically disposed among them could use the Christian Kabbalah for the identification of both heterogeneous disciplines. The expression Christian Kabbalah is not yet used by its first representatives named above. It first surfaces as the title of a didactic poem by the Franciscan Jean Thénaud, La Sancte et Tres Christian Kabbalah that, though dedicated to King Francis I of France, did not appear in print until our time p. In the numerous printed texts of that kind from the 16th century, this terminology is missing, as is, by the way, any clear connection to alchemy. The definitive blending of these elements emerges most assertively in the large folio of Heinrich Kunrath of Leipzig, 1560 to 1605, at the time a famous alchemist and mystic. Titled, Amphitheatrum Sapienia Septemtis Solius Vere, Christiano Kabbalisticum, Divinum Magicum ne non Physico-Chemicum Tertrinum Catholicum Hanover. 1609, it emphatically argues for this identification process. The verbose author revels in the pictorial world of the disciplines listed by him on the title page. His ideas of what constitutes Kabbalism are evidently determined by a compendium published by Johann Nidanus Pistorius, Artes Kabbalistic, Basel 1587, a folio of nearly 1,000 pages in which 2 authentic texts of Kabbalah are grouped with Christian Kabbalist writings by Pico, Reuchlin, Riccio, the Franciscan Archangelus de Borgonovo, and the popular Dialogi di Amore, by Leo Hebreus, Luda Abrabanel. All this heterogeneous material, which has nothing or very little to with authentic Kabbalah, is accepted by Pistorius as Kabbalist without, as far as he can see, naming any sources. Conrath's interest in alchemy, especially if mystically understood, was overwhelming and forms the theme for his earlier writings. In one of them, which was distributed widely, he treats the rich symbolism of the Hylic chaos as the prima materia of alchemy and thus contributes to the analogy made between God's 7-day work of creation and the respective stages of the great work of the alchemists. Is. The full-page allegorical engravings of Kunrath's work, which were published separately several years earlier, were considered in alchemist and theosophist circles as important representations of Kabbalah to p. These engravings also fell into the hands of Jacob ben Hayim, the famous Kabbalist of the Lurian school. Apparently while he was still in his crypto-Jewish Marano period in Spain, before he openly converted back to Judaism in Salonika. He makes fun of it in one of his polemical writings against falsifications of the Christian Kabbalah. He does not mention Kunrath by name, but his description leaves us no doubt about the identity of his source L. The highly regarded lexicon Alchemier by the Paracelsus disciple Martin Rouland, published shortly after Kunrath's work, was rather cautious in its judgment. while in the following decades, Kunrath's identification was almost taken for granted. Another identification of Kabbalah with alchemy, dating from around Kunrath's time, occurred in the interpolations of Pierre Arnauld de la Chevalerie, which was inserted into his first edition of Nicolas Flamel's Livre des Figures Hiéroglyphiques Paris, 1612. Describing the folios of the alleged papyrus book, which Flamel had discovered, Arnauld put the words into Flamel's mouth that no one would be able to understand alchemy without having an advanced knowledge of their, e.g., the Jews' traditional Kabbalah traditive, and assiduously studying its books, even though the work of alchemy is introduced here with great diligence and skill. When 62. Around the same time, the Paracelsus disciple Franz Kieser, who had knowledge of Kunrath's unpublished writings, combined Kabbalah and alchemy in a similar way. He published a kind of distillation of Paracelsus's doctrines, Kabbalah Chemica Frankfurt 1606, in which it says that magic is the philosophy of the alchemists and, belonging to this, a preferred part of the Kabbalah. True to Paracelsus, distinguishing of course between a devilish corrupt Kabbalah and an unflawed one, which is none other than the highest completion of true philosophy. In the same book he declares, like Flamer's interpolator, and later Thomas Vaughan, it can clearly be assumed that no one will attain the sum arcani, the sum of all secrets in eternity, unless he is experienced in magic and Kabbalah. This comes very close to Kunrath's sentence that Kabbalah, magic and alchemy shall and must be combined and used together. 1. The mystical conception of alchemy found its most influential expression, shortly after, in the writings by the so-called Rosicrucians, which began to be published in 1614. Especially the Chemische Hochzeit Christiani Rosenkreuz, which today is acknowledged to be authored by the Swabian theologist and theosophist Johann Valentin Andres, 1586 to 1654, who as an enthusiastic youth had dreamed of a mystical reformation of Christianity. Whether or not there existed a true Rosicrucian brotherhood prior to the 18th century is irrelevant to our purposes. However, some of the arguments provoked by these early Rosicrucian writings are significant here because of their lasting effect. Especially important for establishing the wide recognition of the link between Christian Kabbalah and alchemy and magic were the English theosophers, who actively participated in these debates and exerted enormous influence on the organization of Rosicrucianism in the 18th century. I am thinking here of Thomas Vaughan, 1641 to 1666, and the slightly older Robert Flood, 1574 to 1637. The equivalence of Kabbalist and alchemical symbols is pervasive in several of Flood's writings, whereby, of course, the making of gold is only a material symbol for the transmutation of mankind toward the stage of perfection in Christ. In Flood's tractate Truth's Golden Harrow, written around 1625-1, and in his last major book, Philosophia Moisaica 1638, one finds in a Kabbalist symbolism of the two forms of the letter Aleph, the alchemical transmutation of the dark prima materia into the brightly shining stone of wisdom. In his explanation of the Hebrew alphabet, Jacob Hakahen, a 13th century Spanish Kabbalist from Soria Distin, gishes between a dark external form of the letters and a lighter mystical one, symbolized on the parchment of the Torah by the white blank space between the black inked shapes. Reuchlin, who had read this tractate in a Kabbalist manuscript, prompted Flood to adopt this alchemical reinterpretation, which appears frequently in the latter's writings. According to Flood, the precious stones on the breastplate of a high priest, which had already been interpreted mystically by the Kabbalists as lights called in the Torah Urim V'Tumim, the shining letters of the oracle, although its original meaning is no longer clear, allude to the process of transformation of the stones into the stone of wisdom, which is just this Urim. Thus, in addition to images from many other sources, alchemical interpretations of biblical verses and Kabbalist motives, probably going back to Pistorius, pervade Flood's writings. The same may be said about the tractates of Thomas Vaughan, which were still being read in the 18th century and which always combined and related both symbolic worlds. In his Magia Adamica, Vaughan states explicitly that the Kabbalah of the Jews is chemical and expresses itself in natural events, referring however to his source as the fictitious book of the Jew Abraham, whose revelations were based on Nicolas Flamel. These texts were all written about 25 to 50 years prior to the publication of the Kabbalah Denudata. It is only natural that kindred spirits such as these authors would find in Knorr von Rosenroth's work the confirmation of their long-fostered opinion on the harmony, if not identity, between alchemy and Kabbalah. But even 2 years after the first volume of the Kabbalah Denudata, which contains the Esh Me'aref, the Colum Sephiroticum Hebrarorum by Johann Christophorus Stieb Mainz, 1679, makes no reference to these new developments, and the sky of the Sephirot is here described exclusively by the means provided by Agrippa and the Compendium of Pistorius, with medicine and natural science, and embellished with alchemy. I am unable to say when the use of the two intersecting triangles of the hexagram were adopted by alchemists as a symbol for the alchemical connection of fire and water. It has been explained with the midrashic interpretation of the Hebrew word for sky shamayim, as a combination of esh fire and mayim water. In any case, around 1720 the symbol was already popular in alchemy. Puckert cites the hexagram in the circle as a magic sign used by Jews, allegedly in necromancy, whereby he refers to Paracelsus, but concedes Iris notes that the respective drawing exists only in a handwritten marginalia in a copy of Husserl's edition of Paracelsus's writings, which Puckert used in Rocklaw. Magical hexagrams appeared, of course, in Jewish amulets, albeit not exclusively so. As the seal of Solomon and later as the shield of David, surely this Jewish terminology was known to the alchemical author who in 1724 published in Berleburg, a famous center of Christian theosophy, a booklet titled Naturae Numerantis and Naturator Mystinum, in Scuto Davidico Exhibitum. At the conclusion of this development stand two southern German theosophists, in whose writings Kabbalah and alchemy are joined in a kind of intimate union, the formation of which I have been trying to describe. Both were markedly mystical spirits who sought to unfold a universal symbolism. They are Georg von Welling, 1652 to 1727, and the Swabian prelate and theosopher Friedrich Christoph Oettinger, 1702 to 1782. Both men of great influence on their generation and the one succeeding them. Welling's main work fully discloses its nature on the title page. It was first published completely as Opus Mago Kabbalisticum et Theosophicum, including therein the origin, nature, characteristics and usage of salt, sulfur and mercury described in 3 parts, and among several odd mathematic, theosophic, magic and mystic materials, the production of metals and minerals on the ground of nature will be illustrated, including the main key to the work as a whole, and various strange Mago-Kabbalistic figures. In addition, there will be provided a treatise on divine wisdom and a special appendix of a number of very rare and precious chemical ingredients. This book was lying on Goethe's desk at the time he joined the circle of Susanna von Klettenberg, and Goethe also describes it in the second part of Poetry and Truth. The intention of Welling was essentially the same as that of Paracelsus, who was resolved to relate the two lights, the light of grace and the light of nature, and demonstrate therein their efficacy. As Welling says in the preface, his ambition is not to teach physical alchemy, the making of gold, but rather it is directed at something much higher, namely, how nature can be seen in God, and how God can be recognized in the same, and how furthermore from this wisdom the true service of the creature as an ode thank-offering emanates toward the Creator. The voluminous book is dominated by theosophically reinterpreted alchemical ideas, but also interwoven with concepts by the Mago-Kabbalists, whereby a total amalgamation of these two areas is achieved. The expression Mage Kabbalah reflects the continually evolving intertwining of magic and Kabbalah that has occurred since Pico, and which can be found in all previously encountered texts, and also in Jacob Boehme. Without a doubt, Welling, who was highly educated and literate, adopted some Jewish Kabbalist ideas, and also was well acquainted with Knorr von Rosenroth's Kabbalah Denudata. Essentially, however, his notion of Kabbalah is not that different from Paracelsus and his school, and thus relates to Jewish tradition in name only. The fundamental myth that forms the starting point of Welling's work, especially in the first chapter on salt and the 7-day work of creation, and was adopted later by many others, is foreign to Kabbalist tradition. It is an original version of the revolt of Lucifer at the beginning of the creation, which derives from the Jewish Apocalypse, the Book of Enoch, and was further expanded by the Gnostics. Welling's basic thoughts in this regard have rightly been called a cosmic history myth. At the beginning there was the world of light of God and the spirits, at the center of which stood Lucifer, reflecting the divine as the first and most magnificent of God's creatures. But Lucifer's will inhibited the effect of the divine light. Thus in his sphere arose a space of chaos, of darkness and gravity, from which God created the solar system. While reveling in the consciousness and appreciation of the encompassing glory, Lucifer had in fact forgotten his origin and therefore, by developing his own will, sequestered himself from God. According to God's plan, it was Adam, not Lucifer, who was supposed to be in his image and dominate the earth. But Adam turned away from God in his fall, and this results in the battle between Lucifer's forces and those of God in the creation and humankind itself. Only at the end of days will God's interfering fire of strength transform the world, restore God's world of light, and return all beings, eventually even Lucifer, to their original harmonic, pre-dialectical state. Thus each of Paracelsus's three basic alchemical elements, salt, sulfur and mercury, have a special relation to one of the epochs of salvific history. Salt to God's world of lights, the fall of Lucifer, and the creation of the world, sulfur to the balm of life of all creatures, but also to the destroying fire, which determines the state of humans after death and the end of days in the last judgment. And mercury to the bringing back of all things in the eon of the new heavens and the new earth. A Jewish Haggadic element that derived from the Magog Kabbalists but was not necessarily Kabbalist is very significant for Welling. In the Esh Mayim, the fiery water, which precedes the creation of the world, the three elements are combined. Welling represents this union with a circle inscribed with a hexagram just. As for the alchemists, the two intersecting triangles were used as symbols for the elements water and fire. Thus, although Welling was probably unaware of it, it was through him that the figure of the Jewish shield of David acquired the symbolism of perfection in many alchemical and Rosicrucian texts of the 18th century. Of course, Welling also mentions authentic Kabbalist ideas such as the speculations on the Seyarot, through which the Hebraic Magog Kabbalists point out the different effects of the Godhead on the spirits, angels, and earthly creatures. P. It is precisely from this that he breaks away, however, most decisively. This shows how little his book could have been a source for the knowledge of Jewish Kabbalah, and how here everything was becoming Christian and alchemical mystical. He wrote P. solely because we never could rhyme together all these mysteries and wonderful allocations with the truth of the Holy Scriptures, indeed also not have any reason to do so. Because they, the Jews, do not recognize the revelation of the Divine Majesty's fiat. Their Kabbalah is such that one cannot force anything from it. But he who knows how to combine all the pieces of the New Testament with the Old Testament has learned the correct Kabbalah perfectly. The Jewish Kabbalah is nothing other than an abuse of divine names. With this deformation or transformation, if not transmutation, of the Jewish Kabbalah into something purely Christian, and thus more accessible for the alchemical reinterpretation, we have reached the end of the process that has occupied us here. So influential was Welling's book, that it was used as a main source of ideas in the formation of Freemasonry around 1780. Both the didactic publications of the Masonic Circle of Golden and Rosy Cross, and those of the Asiatic Brethren, which partially originated in the same circle but distanced themselves polemically from it, adopted Welling's Lufulcer myth almost verbatim. Astonishingly, in the writings of the Asiatic Brethren, pseudo-Kabbalist mythology and authentic Kabbalist tradition joined together on the subject of the beginnings of creation, albeit one that derived from the heretic circle of the later adherents of Sabbatai Sevi. The authentic connection of Jewish Kabbalah with an alchemistic mystical symbolism of Christian character that was finally adopted by Friedrich Christoph Oettinger, derived from theology and from published Christian interpreted excerpts of the Zohar 169. Jacob Bauma, who developed a Kabbalist symbolism of his own, was brought to Oettinger's attention by the Frankfurt Kabbalist Koppel Hecht. It is not necessary to discuss this chapter further here, since we now have two excellent studies on the prehistory of Kabbalist traditions in Swabian theology of the 17th century and the Kabbalist and alchemical symbolism in Oettinger by F. Hausermann, who delved deeply into these subjects.